Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The last ride to Ghost City. It's strange, isn't it, how we can take something so normal, like a train ride, and suddenly find ourselves hurtling towards something we can't explain? The click-clack of the wheels on the tracks, the hum of the engine, it all felt so ordinary. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't shake off. A chill that crept into my bones, despite the warmth of the train compartment. A feeling that something wasn't right. I sat by the window, watching the blur of trees and buildings as we sped through the darkened countryside. The clock on the wall of the compartment read almost midnight. I glanced around, noticing the other passengers. There weren't many of us, just a handful of tired faces, each lost in their own thoughts. A man in a gray suit stared blankly out the window, his eyes hollow. A young woman, clutching a child, whispered softly to herself. They seemed oblivious to the unease in the air. But not me. The train slowed as we approached what appeared to be an old, abandoned station. The platform was long, deserted, overgrown with weeds. A ghostly fog hung over the tracks, making the night air thick and suffocating. It wasn't supposed to be like this, not according to the schedule. But the train didn't stop. It slowed, then came to a complete halt, the wheels groaning against the steel. A loud clank echoed through the train, the doors creaking open. The air outside was heavier than it had been before, thick with the smell of decay. The conductor, a pale man with sunken eyes, stepped into the compartment. His face was impassive, but his hands trembled slightly as he checked the clock. "Next stop, Ghost City," he said, his voice flat, without emotion. I froze. I'd heard of Ghost City, of course. The stories were whispered in the dark corners of the city, tales of a place that had vanished from the maps decades ago, a place that no one visited because there was nothing left. They said the city was cursed, abandoned, and forgotten, left to rot under the weight of its own secrets. But this felt too real. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I glanced around the compartment. No one seemed to notice anything odd. They were either too tired or too disinterested to care. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something that was far beyond my understanding. Something that was watching us. The train doors remained open, but no one moved to get off. No one seemed to want to acknowledge the eerie stillness that surrounded us. The conductor, with a last look at the platform, stepped back inside the train, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Without a word, he signaled to the engineer, and the train lurched forward again, continuing its journey into the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed a line. That something had changed. That Ghost City was not just a place on the map, but something much darker, waiting for us. As we moved farther into the mist, the train's lights flickered for a brief moment, casting long, ghostly shadows across the compartment. For the first time, I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable as it grew louder, the sound of something scurrying across the tracks. The noise grew stronger, more distinct, like the faint scratching of claws on metal. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a tightness in my chest. Something was waiting for us, something that was not a part of this world. The train picked up speed, the tracks singing beneath us. But the whispering noise, those scratching, scuttling sounds, did not fade. It only grew louder, echoing through the carriages, like 1,000 tiny feet racing along the walls and floor. I couldn't place it, but every fiber of my being told me that it wasn't natural. Something, or someone, was out there. I glanced nervously around the compartment. The passengers seemed unaffected, as though they were in some kind of trance. The young woman with the child, her face pale and drawn, tightened her grip on the boy, but she didn't move. The man in the gray suit never looked away from the window, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his fingers twitching slightly. I couldn't help myself. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and walked toward the door at the far end of the carriage. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was pressing down on me, weighing me down. When I reached the door, I paused, my hand hovering over the cold metal handle. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. The only sound was the eerie whispering and the occasional clink of the train's wheels against the track. I hesitated for a long moment before I opened the door, stepping out onto the small platform at the rear of the train. The air hit me immediately, a biting, damp cold that made my skin crawl. The mist had thickened, and the city we were approaching was barely visible through the fog. But there was something in the distance. A shadow. Something moving. I stepped back into the train, heart racing, and shut the door behind me. I leaned against it, breath coming in shallow bursts. What the hell was that? A low thud reverberated through the train, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The lights flickered again, this time dimming before returning to their harsh, fluorescent glow. I glanced toward the front of the train, toward the conductor, who was still standing motionless in his cabin, his back to us. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw his face, faint, but there, watching us. Then the mist parted for a brief second, and I caught my first full glimpse of Ghost City. It was exactly as the rumors described. A ghost town with buildings that were half collapsed, windows shattered, and rooftops overgrown with vines. But there was something wrong. There was an unnatural stillness about it, a silence that felt too complete. No movement. No signs of life. It was as if the city had been abandoned in the middle of some forgotten moment in time. Suddenly, the train lurched again. But this time, it wasn't the usual gentle shift. It was a violent jolt that threw me off balance, sending me crashing into the wall. My breath caught in my throat as I struggled to stay upright. The whispers, they were louder now. And they were no longer just noises. They were voices, low, guttural, like a chorus of something ancient, something angry. I looked toward the windows, trying to find the source of the sound, but I could see nothing. Just the dark mist pressing on us from all sides. A flash of movement caught my eye. A shadow, long and thin, darted across the train's window. My heart stopped. It was too fast for me to make out clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was large, its shape wrong. A creature, perhaps. But what? And where had it gone? The train lurched again, and this time, the noise from the outside intensified. The scratching sounds had turned into something more deliberate. Heavy thuds, like the stomping of enormous feet, followed by a deep, guttural growl. I looked to the passengers. Nothing. They still sat in their seats, oblivious, as if nothing was happening. As if everything was normal. I pressed my hand to the cold glass of the window, the mist now thick enough that I could barely see through it. And then, I heard it, a soft, distant squeal, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scrabbling, claws scraping across metal. A moment later, the lights flickered once more, and this time they did not return. The train plunged into darkness. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering voices grew louder. I could feel the presence of something close, too close, watching us. Something was moving through the train, its presence felt in every creak of the floor, every shift of the air. It was close now, so close that I could almost hear its breathing, low and ragged, like it was right behind me. My pulse thundered in my ears. Was it real? Was this just some hallucination, some twisted dream? Or had the train truly entered a place where the lines between reality and something else had blurred? The train screeched as if it were on the verge of breaking, and then silence. Total, absolute silence. And then, in the pitch black, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, relentless. I froze. My heart slammed in my chest, each beat reverberating like an explosion in my ears. The footsteps, heavy, deliberate, came closer. They weren't the quick, light steps of someone running, but the slow, methodical pace of something or someone approaching with purpose. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my throat was tight, choked by an invisible force. The air felt thick, like it was closing in on me, pushing me deeper into my seat. The others around me remained unmoving, their faces in the same trance-like state, their eyes glazed over. Was it fear that held them still? Or something else? Something deeper, more sinister? The footsteps came closer, and I knew that whatever was out there, whatever was walking through the darkness, was not human. It was something else, something twisted. I could feel it in the air, a presence that wasn't supposed to be here. It didn't belong in this world. The train jolted again, the metallic screech of the wheels against the tracks deafening in the stillness. The dim light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls of the carriage. In one of those fleeting moments of light, I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the compartment, just outside the glow of the flickering bulb. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. Its shape was too tall, too thin. Its body hunched, as if it were not accustomed to standing upright. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see its eyes, glowing faintly, a dull yellow that shone in the dark like the eyes of a predator. They gleamed with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body was locked in place, my mind screaming at me to run, to do something, anything, to escape. And then the whispering voices returned. But now they weren't just whispers. They were calls, shouts, pleading voices that echoed in the stillness, a chorus of torment. The words were muffled, as if coming from a great distance, but I could hear the urgency in them. The desperation. Help us, help us. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of something scraping against the walls, claws, perhaps, or nails. It was getting closer, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was as if the very air itself had turned heavy, thick with malice. And then it was there. The creature stepped into the flickering light, its body thin and long, its limbs bent in unnatural angles. It wore the remnants of clothing, ripped, torn fabric hanging from its frame like shreds of a forgotten life. Its face was a twisted mask of anguish and hunger, a pale, hollow visage with deep sockets where eyes should have been. But those eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, burned from the darkness of its skull. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and calculating. Please, you can't stay. The voice came from nowhere, but it was unmistakable. It was the voice of a woman with a child. Her face, so still, so blank, was now filled with terror as she whispered those words to no one in particular. She knew. She knew that the train was no longer a safe place. We were trapped in this cursed place, with no way out. I turned, trying to make sense of what was happening. The shadows in the train seemed to shift, to move, as if they were alive. The walls seemed to bend inward, closing us off from the outside world. The creature, now moving closer, seemed to feed off the fear in the air, its body jerking with each step, its mouth opening in a grotesque grin. "Not all of us will leave," it hissed, its voice a rasping whisper that crawled beneath my skin, sinking into my very bones. I felt my knees buckle. I had to get out. I had to do something. But what could I do against something like this? The creature's eyes burned into mine, and for a moment I saw flashes of images, visions, rushing through my mind, too fast to comprehend. But one thing stood out, like a beacon of clarity amidst the chaos. The train. The city. The fog. It was all part of it. The train had stopped here for a reason. This place, this moment, was where time twisted, where the past and present collided. We weren't just passengers on a journey. We were part of something older, something far darker than we could ever understand. "Leave now," the creature growled, its voice like nails scraping on a chalkboard. "While you still can." Suddenly, the lights went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though they were closing in from every side. I had to get out. I had to leave. But I didn't know where to go, or how to escape. The train, this place, everything felt wrong. There was no way to know what was real anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to think clearly. But it was too late. The sound of claws scraping against the floor, the heavy breathing, the growls, they were all around me now. The creature was closing in. There was no escape. And then, all at once, the silence was shattered by a terrible, agonizing scream. The scream echoed through the darkness, a wretched sound that clawed at my soul. It wasn't a human scream. It was the kind of scream that only something trapped between this world and another could produce. A scream that carried the weight of centuries of suffering, of endless torment. I turned, instinctively trying to locate the source of the sound, but the darkness around me had thickened. It was like the shadows themselves were alive, reaching, twisting, suffocating the space. I could no longer see the creature, but I could feel it, a presence looming just behind me, its breath hot and foul on the back of my neck. The other passengers were still frozen, their eyes wide open but unseeing, as if they had been absorbed by the nightmarish force that had taken over the train. It was as if they were no longer real, just empty vessels waiting to be claimed. The woman with the child, the last to scream, was nowhere to be seen, her face gone from the stillness. Had she been taken? Or had she fallen to the horrors in the darkness? "Where are you going?" a voice rasped in my ear, too close. I felt the presence now, its breath tickling the side of my face. The creature was speaking to me. I couldn't bring myself to respond. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear, by the overwhelming sensation that there was no escape. I had to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My mind screamed in my body to move, but it was like I was encased in a block of ice, frozen by sheer terror. The train rattled on, the rhythmic sound of the tracks beneath us suddenly louder, more insistent. The oppressive weight of the creature's gaze pressed down on me, and I felt the air grow even heavier, as if the train were sinking into the very bowels of the earth. I had to do something. But what? What could I do? Suddenly, the train lurched violently, throwing me from my seat. I landed on the floor with a hard thud, the impact knocking the breath from my chest. The lights flickered wildly, casting brief, fractured glimpses of the nightmare around me. In that moment, I saw it again. The creature. Its thin, bony hands stretched out toward me, fingers elongated like claws, scraping the floor with a sharp, bone-chilling noise. Its face, a grotesque mask of hunger and agony, was inches from mine. Its eyes, those terrible, burning eyes, were locked on mine, pulling me into their depths. I had no choice. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through my veins, and lunged toward the nearest door. The sound of my heartbeat thudded in my ears as I fumbled with the handle, desperate to get away, to escape the suffocating presence that was closing in. The door wouldn't budge. It was locked. I yanked harder, my fingers slipping on the cold metal. The creature's hand grazed my shoulder, sending an electric shock of terror through my body. I cried out, stumbling backward, but before I could fall, a horrible, guttural laugh rumbled through the darkness. "Where do you think you're going?" The creature's voice was low, mocking, as if it were toying with me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The train was no longer just a place, it was a trap, a cage from which there was no escape. The lights flickered once more, and I saw the passengers, their faces, their eyes, vacant, lifeless. They had become nothing more than hollow shells. I heard it again, the scraping sound, closer now, more intense, like something was tearing its way through the walls of the train. It was as if the train itself was disintegrating, falling apart piece by piece. And then, something else. A sharp, sickening crack. The floor beneath me trembled, and I realized with a sickening lurch that the train was no longer moving along the tracks. We were sinking. The walls were bending inward, the ceiling dropping lower, pressing down on us. The train had become a coffin, a claustrophobic tomb. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that we were all going to die here. "Not all of you will leave," the creature whispered again, its voice a serpent's hiss, echoing in the encroaching dark. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have stayed." My heart pounded in my chest as I desperately searched for any way out. But there was no exit, no way to escape. We were trapped in a place that existed between worlds, caught in an endless loop of suffering, unable to break free. The ground gave way beneath me. The train lurched violently, throwing me into the air, and then the world went black. I awoke in total darkness, the same oppressive silence hanging in the air. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, that the horrors of the train had been nothing more than a twisted nightmare. But then, I felt it. The cold, wet floor beneath me. The scent of decay. The distant, echoing sound of something scratching, dragging itself across the ground. I wasn't alone. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had no idea where I was, or how long I had been unconscious. The world around me was a blur, but I could sense the presence of something in the dark. Something moving, waiting. "Why are you still here?" a voice whispered from the shadows. I turned, fear clutching at my chest. There, standing in the dark, was the woman, the one who had screamed. But her face was no longer the same. Her eyes were wide open, but they were blank, lifeless. Her mouth moved, but the words she spoke were not hers. "Get out. You've seen too much. It's not too late to leave. You can still go back. You can still save yourself." Her voice was hollow, empty, and it felt as though the words were being spoken not by her, but by something else. Something that had taken control. I backed away, my legs trembling, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would explode. I had to get out. But the only way was through the dark, through the endless, suffocating blackness that had become my prison. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shook again, and I heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping across the floor. The creature, its presence, its hunger, was still there. I ran. But there was nowhere to run to. No way to escape the nightmare that had swallowed me whole. And then, everything went silent. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, my body trembling with the fear of what would come next. But the silence stretched on, deep and endless. For the first time, I realized the truth. The train, the city, the shadows, the screams, none of it had ever been real. It was a trap, a construct of madness designed to lure those who dared to enter. I had become part of it, part of a never-ending cycle. I would never leave. And neither would anyone else. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was the soft whisper of the creature, one final, chilling message. "Welcome to your eternity." Ghosts on the hot roads. Have you ever felt like something's not right, even though everything seems normal? That's how I felt tonight. I've driven this stretch of highway 1,000 times, but tonight it was different. I was behind the wheel of my old truck, cruising along the dark highway. The only light was the pale beam of my headlights cutting through the thick night. The air smelled like burnt rubber and gasoline, heavy with the scent of the road. It was past midnight, and the only thing I could hear was the hum of my engine and the occasional screech of my tires on the asphalt. I'm used to driving these roads alone. It's peaceful, almost meditative. But tonight, something felt off. There was a chill in the air that seemed out of place for this time of year, and the silence felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I glanced in my rearview mirror. Empty. Nothing but the black void of the road stretching behind me. No headlights, no sign of life. I knew this route well. It was quiet this time of night, but it wasn't this quiet. I tried to shake off the feeling, focused on the road ahead. But then the radio crackled to life, interrupting the silence with a burst of static. It was the local news station. And that's the third incident this week. The voice on the radio crackled, sounding strained. Another driver has reported seeing something strange on Route 62. A car appearing out of nowhere, vanishing within minutes. No one can explain it. Locals are getting nervous. I leaned in, my hand instinctively tightening on the steering wheel. It wasn't the first time I had heard about these strange occurrences. There had been rumors for weeks now. Drivers talking about seeing cars that just appear on the road and then disappear into thin air. Some said it was just a trick of the mind, others swore it was something more. But hearing the radio mention it, it gave the stories a sense of reality I hadn't considered before. The announcer continued, but I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was already spinning with thoughts. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were talking about something else. But in my gut, I knew I wasn't ready for what was about to happen. I turned the volume dial down, trying to focus. But then, out of nowhere, something in my headlights caught my attention. A car. It wasn't a normal car, though. It was parked in the middle of the highway, its lights off. The car was old, really old. A sleek black sedan, shiny and polished, but clearly from another era. The chrome trim gleamed in the dark, almost too perfectly, like it had been placed there for a reason. I slowed down, my truck now idling as I got closer. My eyes narrowed. Who would be driving an old car like that at this hour, especially out here? I glanced around. The road was deserted. The car didn't belong. It looked out of place, almost like it had materialized out of nowhere. I eased my truck to a stop, heart beating a little faster now. I couldn't tell if it was the strange car or the unsettling quiet of the night, but something in the pit of my stomach told me I needed to be careful. I debated whether to drive past it or stop and see if someone needed help. I had been on the road long enough to know better than to stop for strangers at night. But curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. My boots crunched against the gravel as I made my way toward the car. Each step felt heavier than the last, my senses screaming at me to turn around. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No answer. No movement. I was about to reach for the door handle when I saw movement. A figure darting between the trees along the side of the road. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, staring into the shadows, but the figure was already gone. It was just a glimpse, but it felt wrong. Like something I wasn't supposed to see. My body tensed. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The car. I turned my attention back to the sedan. The windows were dark, no one inside. But then, the headlights flickered. Once, twice. A faint glimmer of light that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Then, they went out completely. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I took a step back. The air around me felt heavy, like something was closing in. I looked around again, but the figure was gone. The trees were still. But then I heard it. A scraping sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Metal dragging across the road. The sound was soft, almost like it was just on the edge of my hearing. I turned sharply toward the noise, trying to pinpoint its source, but there was nothing there. I turned back toward the truck, my steps quickening as I rushed toward it. That scraping noise. It wasn't coming from the car. It was coming from the shadows. From somewhere close by. I opened the door, jumped into the seat, and slammed it shut behind me. My breath came out in a frantic rush. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal without a second thought. The tires screamed against the pavement as I tore down the road, the engine roaring to life. But even as I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was behind me, following me. I dared not look in the rearview mirror. I had to keep moving, keep going. But the road ahead was as dark as the one I had left behind. And deep down, I knew that whatever I had just encountered, it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't stop. Not for miles. My foot stayed heavy on the accelerator, the truck roaring like a beast, devouring the asphalt beneath me. The cold air that rushed through the open window only made the dread in my chest grow heavier. Every flicker of light in the rearview mirror, every shadow that seemed to move, had me on edge. What had I seen back there? The figure? The car? And that scraping sound? It was all too surreal to grasp, but I knew one thing, whatever it wasn't natural. The hum of the tires on the road was the only sound now. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, willing myself to forget what had happened. But the feeling of being watched, the sense that something was wrong, crept into every inch of my being. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, that it was just a weird encounter. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then, as if the universe wanted to test my resolve, something caught my eye. Off to the side of the road, at the corner of the distant horizon, I saw a light. Not a car, not headlights, but a faint glow. It flickered and danced like a lantern suspended in midair. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing things. But when I opened them again, the light was still there. For a split second, I thought about pulling over. Maybe it was someone else who had broken down. Maybe someone else who needed help. But the thought was fleeting. The idea of stopping, of stepping out into that pitch-black night, was terrifying. I was already shaken enough from the last encounter. I forced my gaze forward and kept driving. The light stayed in my peripheral vision for a while, like a strange beacon that refused to let me go. I could feel it pulling at my thoughts. What if it was real? What if someone was out there? No, I couldn't. I wasn't going to do this to myself. My truck's headlights, bright as they were cutting through the darkness, but they couldn't touch the edges of that eerie glow. I couldn't shake the feeling that the road was stretching on forever, and the distance between me and safety was growing with every mile. I pressed harder on the gas. But as the minutes dragged on, that strange, creeping unease built up again. Something was wrong. The road, the night, everything was wrong. The usual sounds, the hum of the engine, the sound of tires, had faded into the background. The air was too still. And then, like a wave crashing over me, it hit. A sharp, metallic screech, followed by a low rumble. At first, I thought it was the truck, but it wasn't. It was coming from somewhere else, closer. I jerked my head toward the sound, heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. The road was empty. Then, I heard it again. Closer. This time, it was accompanied by a faint sound, almost like footsteps, or something like them. A slow, deliberate tapping, as if something heavy was dragging itself along the ground. I couldn't breathe. The sound was coming from the other side of the road, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I didn't want to look. I couldn't look. But the curiosity, no, the fear, was too much. I turned my head just slightly, my eyes scanning the darkness, praying it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. A shape. Something crawling. Slowly. Purposefully. The shape was too large, too long, to be human. Its movements were erratic, jerking back and forth like it was testing its surroundings. The screeching sound followed it, like claws dragging against concrete. I gasped, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My pulse pounded in my ears. That wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The figure, whatever it was, moved closer to the edge of the road, its dark shape almost blending with the night, but not quite. I could see the glint of something reflecting in the faint light, like eyes that gleamed in the darkness, too wide and too bright. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It could be an animal, right? A bear or something? But the shape was all wrong. And the sound, no animal made that kind of noise. Not that loud, not that deliberate. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. My truck lurched forward, speeding away from whatever it was. My eyes stayed fixed on the road, but I could feel the weight of those eyes following me, burning into my back, sending shivers crawling up my spine. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. Not this time. Not with that thing out there. The wind whipped through the open window, making the truck shake as I sped down the highway. But no matter how fast I went, the feeling of something chasing me, something following me, stayed with me. It clung to me like a shadow in my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything fell silent again. The sound of dragging claws, the tapping footsteps, gone. But I knew that silence wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before something terrible happens. I pressed on, faster now, my breath coming in quick bursts. I just wanted to get away from whatever had been watching me. I had no idea what it was or what it wanted, but I knew one thing: it wasn't done yet. I had been driving for what felt like hours. The fear was still there, simmering beneath my skin, gnawing at my mind. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, my stomach twisted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, following me, even though the road was empty. The night seemed endless, stretching on and on, as if it was mocking me. My headlights cut through the darkness, but the darkness never seemed to recede. I kept my hands firmly on the wheel, my knuckles white. Sweat clung to my back, and I could feel the cool air from the window stinging my face. But it wasn't enough to push the tight knot of fear out of my chest. A part of me wanted to stop, pull over, and just take a break, maybe walk around, clear my head. But then I thought of the thing I had seen, the thing crawling in the dark. I couldn't stop now. Not with it out there. I had to keep moving. I had to outrun it. But even as I sped down the highway, I couldn't escape the creeping feeling that I was being watched. Every flicker of movement in the darkness, every odd shadow in the corner of my vision, made my heart race faster. I could hear it again, the faintest scraping sound, like claws dragging across concrete. It was too quiet to be real, yet it seemed to grow louder with every passing second. I twisted my head, trying to see something, anything, but the darkness was thick. The road was lined with trees and abandoned buildings, their silhouettes just barely visible in the faint light of the moon. There was nothing there. But the sound, it was real. I could hear it clearly now, as if something, someone, was right behind me. Then, something caught my eye. A flash of movement, a shimmer of light. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching as it slowed down. I was still on the road, but I couldn't take my eyes off what I had just seen. A car. A car was ahead of me, parked off to the side of the highway. It was just sitting there, idle, its headlights dim, barely visible in the darkness. At first, I thought it might be another vehicle, but as I got closer, I noticed the strange stillness of it. No one was inside. No movement. It was like a mirage, there one moment, gone the next. I slowed down, my eyes darting between the empty car and the road ahead. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The truck's engine rumbled as I edged closer to the car. But just as I passed it, the headlights flickered once, then went out completely. I froze, my foot still on the brake. The engine had died, as if the car had been waiting for me to approach. I knew I should keep driving, but the pull to stop, to get out and investigate, was almost overwhelming. My mind raced. Was it another person who needed help? Or was it something else? Was it part of it? I gripped the wheel tighter, fighting the urge to stop. Whatever was out there, whatever had been stalking me, wasn't going to show itself in a way I could understand. I had to keep going. But just as I was about to move forward, I saw something in my peripheral vision. A shadow, no, not a shadow, a figure, standing in the middle of the road ahead of me. My heart stopped. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body slender and stretched. The outline was vague, distorted by the darkness, but the shape was unmistakable. The figure stood still, unmoving, blocking the road completely. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed by fear, my eyes locked on the figure as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move, didn't flinch. It was as though it was waiting for me. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. The wind outside seemed to stop, the air heavy and still. My foot was frozen on the brake. I couldn't think, couldn't move. The only sound was the faint scrape of something, like claws, coming from somewhere behind me. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. But the closer I got, the more I felt its presence, like something cold pressing against my skin. The road seemed to stretch out, elongating as I approached. And then, it was gone. The figure disappeared, fading into the darkness as if it had never been there. The road ahead was clear again. My breath came in ragged gasps. I blinked, confused. Had I imagined it? Had I just been seeing things? But deep down, I knew I hadn't. It had been real. The fear that flooded me was too sharp to deny it. Whatever that thing was, whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me. I forced myself to move again, hitting the accelerator as fast as I could. The engine roared to life, and I pushed forward, leaving that spot in my rearview mirror. But even as I did, I could feel the weight of something following me, watching me. The sound of dragging claws was louder now, closer. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't outrun it forever. The miles dragged on, but my mind couldn't settle. The night was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. Every shadow seemed to hold something menacing, and every sound twisted my nerves tighter. The scraping of claws, the flicker of headlights, the sensation of eyes watching, no matter how fast I drove, it all followed. I wasn't just driving through the night anymore, I was trapped in it. I kept looking over my shoulder, my heart skipping at every passing tree or flickering light. My knuckles were raw from gripping the wheel so tightly, and my palms were slick with sweat. But no matter how much I told myself to focus, to keep driving, a cold, irrational part of me wondered, what if I was already too late? What if it had already caught me? The idea seemed insane, yet the fear gnawed at my chest, a constant, pulsing ache. I could still hear the scraping sound, like claws dragging across the pavement. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was closer. Clearer. Alive. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just the wind or the tires on the road. But the sound kept changing, growing in intensity, shifting from something small and far away to something heavy, something undeniable. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, expecting to see nothing. But what I saw froze me in place. A car. A car was following me. I couldn't make out the details, but the headlights shone through the mirror, dim and distant, just like the one I had passed earlier. The vehicle seemed to be gaining on me, though I hadn't heard it approach. It was silent. Too silent. I felt a cold shiver slide down my spine. I should have been alone. There was no one else on this road. Not now. Not at this hour. But the car was there. I slammed on the gas, desperate to put distance between myself and the strange vehicle. But the faster I drove, the closer it seemed to get. The headlights glowed brighter, burning my vision with a harsh, unnatural light. I couldn't keep up the speed for long, the truck's engine protesting as I pushed it further. The car behind me matched my every move. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But there it was, keeping pace with me. The sound of its engine, low, humming like some predatory beast, filled my ears. It sounded too smooth, too perfect, like it wasn't even working at all. I glanced back once more, only to see nothing. The road stretched endlessly before me, empty and dark. No car. No headlights. No sound. Just the hum of my truck's engine. Was I losing my mind? I shook my head, trying to focus. This couldn't be happening. The fatigue, the fear, the isolation, it was all taking a toll on me. But I couldn't let it break me. I had to keep going. I had to survive. And yet, as the road seemed to stretch longer and longer, the scraping sound from earlier returned, this time louder, almost deafening. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It wasn't just the sound of claws anymore. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from all around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone anymore. Something was in the truck. I whipped my head around, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath short and shallow. But there was nothing in the seat beside me, nothing in the back. The truck was still empty. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The absence of sound became even more terrifying than the noises I had been hearing. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to find a way out. I had to. The truck lurched violently, throwing me against the wheel. A jolt ran through the vehicle, and the lights flickered. My pulse raced as I fought to keep control, the road blurring in front of me. And then, in the brief instant before I regained control, I saw it. A figure. It was standing on the edge of the road, silhouetted by the weak light of my headlights. A tall, thin shape, unnaturally still. Its outline seemed to shift in the flickering lights, like it wasn't entirely human. The longer I stared at it, the less real it felt. The truck's tires screeched against the road as I swerved to avoid it. I heard a crash, a violent, bone-rattling crash, but the figure didn't move. It didn't even flinch. The sound echoed through the truck, vibrating in my bones as if the world itself was breaking apart. I had missed it. But I wasn't sure I could keep my hands steady enough to drive much longer. I didn't dare look back again. I couldn't. But the scraping sound? It had stopped. And in its place was something far worse. A voice. It came from somewhere deep in the night, low and rasping, as though it had crawled out of the earth itself. It whispered my name, calling me from the darkness. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone anymore. And I just knew, that I never would be again. The whisper echoed in my mind, a low, guttural sound that scraped against my sanity. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears I couldn't hear the engine of the truck anymore. I wasn't sure where the sound was coming from, but it felt like it was inside the cab, crawling through the air like smoke. Come closer. The words were barely audible, but they pierced through me like a knife. I couldn't breathe. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, but there was nothing. Nothing visible. The road stretched ahead, an endless ribbon of darkness. But the feeling of being watched, that was there. It had never left. I fought the urge to slam on the brakes. To stop. but I couldn't stop. Not now. I had to get away. I had to escape whatever had followed me onto this road. The voice came again, more insistent this time. It wasn't just calling my name anymore, it was a command. Come closer. I twisted the wheel sharply, trying to shake off the sensation. But my hands were trembling. My vision was blurring. The road was no longer a path I recognized. It was a labyrinth, twisting and turning in impossible ways. Each corner I rounded only led to more darkness, more shadows. I was spiraling into something I couldn't comprehend. The truck's engine sputtered, a strange, grinding sound that made me grip the wheel even tighter. I didn't dare look down at the dashboard. I couldn't risk seeing the fuel gauge. I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but the darkness seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if it was alive, pulling me down into it. The headlights barely pierced the gloom anymore. And then I saw it. A figure in the middle of the road. Tall, thin, and barely visible in the darkness, just like before. It stood motionless, waiting. And this time, I could see the outline more clearly. There was something wrong with it. Something impossible. Its body seemed to stretch unnaturally, its limbs too long, its posture too rigid. I slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched, the tires locking up, sending me sliding towards the figure. My heart stopped as the headlights illuminated its face. There was no face. Just a featureless void. An empty space where a face should have been. I tried to turn the wheel, but it was too late. The truck lurched forward, the impact throwing me against the seat. The figure didn't move. I didn't even hit it. It just was there, standing in the center of the road, untouched by the force of the truck. A low growl filled the air, vibrating through the truck's metal frame. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a sound from the figure, it came from somewhere beneath the road, deep in the earth. Something enormous was waiting, just beneath the surface, and it was awake. I stumbled out of the truck, my legs unsteady as I tried to stand. The figure remained unmoving, watching me, its hollow form drawing me closer, pulling me into its emptiness. I couldn't resist. My feet moved on their own, and no matter how hard I tried to stop, I was drawn toward it. The whispers were louder now, no longer a single voice, but a chorus, calling me, urging me forward. My body was shaking uncontrollably as I stepped closer, closer to the darkness. And then, without warning, the earth beneath me cracked. A jagged, gaping hole opened up in the road, a deep chasm that seemed to stretch to the very core of the earth. The ground trembled violently, and I felt my body pulled toward the abyss. I stumbled back, but the pull was too strong. Something was reaching up from below, its fingers, or whatever they were, grasping at my legs, pulling me down. I fought to break free, clawing at the ground, but my hands couldn't grip anything solid. The hole was widening, the darkness swallowing everything around me. The figure remained in the distance, watching, its hollow eyes fixated on me. Then, the whispers stopped. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. Pure, suffocating silence. The wind stopped. The trees stopped rustling. Even the truck's engine, somehow still running, grew quiet, as if the world had simply paused. I looked around, confused. But then I saw it. A shadow, dark and formless, rising up from the hole. It was vast, a mass of shifting blackness that seemed to bend reality itself. The last thing I saw before I was pulled into the abyss were the headlights of the truck, still glowing, still casting their pale light onto the road, illuminating nothing. And then, darkness. Forever. The Lost City. I never believed in legends. Not until the day I heard the whisper. It was the kind of thing you dismiss at first, nothing more than the wind or a trick of the mind. But as I stood on the edge of the Everglades, looking at the map spread out before me, the lines between reality and something darker seemed to blur. Florida. A land of swamps and sunshine, where tourists flooded the beaches, and the air smelled of saltwater and heat. But deep beneath the surface of the state, something else lingered, something forgotten by time, and I was about to uncover it. The lost city of Okeechobee. I had always been a skeptic, but when I found the old journal buried beneath dust and papers in my late grandfather's study, I couldn't ignore the pull. He had been obsessed with it before he died, obsessed with a place no one believed existed, a place lost to history. A city hidden somewhere in the Florida swamps, its memory wiped away as if it had never been. The journal spoke of a time loop, a cycle where the city would appear for brief moments, but only to those who were destined to uncover its secrets. And once you entered, there was no turning back. I told myself it was just a story. Just another one of those things old men dream up to entertain themselves in their final days. But the more I read, the more a strange sensation settled in my gut, a feeling that, somehow, I had been pulled into this, too. I wasn't alone in this search. There were others, men and women who shared the same obsession. We met online, in chat rooms and forums, all drawn by the same force, all desperate to find what had been lost. I knew none of them personally, but we shared the same goal, to find Okeechobee. And now, here I was, on the outskirts of the glades, standing with three others, Sam, a tall, nervous guy who had more books than friends, Jess, an experienced explorer who believed in the impossible, and Noah, who never talked much but had a way of looking at the world that made everything seem just a little bit more sinister. Together, we were about to go deeper into the swamp than anyone had ever dared. I looked at the map again. It seemed to shimmer under the bright Florida sun, as if mocking me. The city's location was marked by a symbol I didn't recognize, a series of overlapping circles that seemed to move while I wasn't looking directly at them. I shook my head. I was already starting to see things. "I think we're close," Jess said, breaking the silence. Her voice had a certain edge to it, like she had been here before. Noah nodded. "We keep following this path, and we'll find something." I can feel it. I wasn't so sure. The air felt thick with humidity, each step forward heavier than the last. The forest around us was unnervingly quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced around, but all I saw were the dark green shadows of the trees and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. The farther we went, the stranger it became. The sky above us, once clear, had turned an oppressive shade of gray. The air was colder now, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Sam kept glancing over his shoulder, and his eyes kept darting nervously in every direction. "What's wrong?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He only quickened his pace, his breath quickening. The silence between us felt like it was stretching, growing longer. And then, as if from nowhere, I heard it. A faint rustling. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the movement of an animal. But then, the rustling grew louder, more purposeful, like something was following us. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced around again. No one was behind us, but the sound, it was definitely closer. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jess stopped in her tracks, her face pale. It's not the wind, she said softly. Something's out there. Suddenly, the rustling stopped, and there was a long stretch of eerie silence. I swallowed hard. Something wasn't right. We continued on, but with every step, I could feel it, the sensation that something was lurking just beyond the trees, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. As we moved deeper into the swamp, I saw it, a figure in the distance, barely visible, standing motionless by the trees. I could only make out the outline, but even from this distance, it was unmistakably human. Who's there? I called out, my voice a mixture of curiosity and unease. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood, unmoving, its silhouette barely visible against the overcast sky. Jess started to walk toward it, but Sam grabbed her arm. No. Don't. It's not right. But it was too late. Jess had already moved forward, and within seconds, she vanished into the dense undergrowth. Jess. I shouted, but there was no answer. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water in the distance and the rustling of leaves. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Wait, Noah said, grabbing my shoulder. Something's wrong. We shouldn't follow her. But it was already too late. We followed, stepping carefully through the thick swamp. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the ground was soggy beneath our boots. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on us, and the closer we got, the more disoriented I became. The path ahead seemed to stretch out endlessly, as if it had no end. And then, just as I thought I saw a glimpse of Jess, I felt it, a sharp coldness, creeping up my spine, the unmistakable feeling of being trapped. Something wasn't right here. We weren't just lost in the swamp. We were losing our way, and with every step, I felt myself slipping further into something darker. Something far older than the city we sought. And that whisper in the back of my mind, it was growing louder. The sun had completely disappeared now, replaced by a dark, oppressive sky. The air felt too still, as if the world had held its breath. Jess had vanished into the swamp, and despite our frantic calls, there was no sign of her. Every rustle of the leaves, every shift in the trees, made my heart race faster. Where the hell did she go? Sam's voice cracked as he scanned the surrounding darkness. I could barely breathe. The tension in the air was suffocating, and the once comforting sounds of the swamp, the croak of frogs, the distant splash of water, had fallen into an unnatural silence. It was as though the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. She can't be far, Noah muttered, eyes darting nervously. We just need to keep looking. But every step forward felt like we were sinking deeper into something that wasn't just the swamp. The trees around us seemed to lean in closer, casting strange, elongated shadows that moved as if they had a life of their own. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, someone, following us. The thought of it made my skin crawl, but there was no one there. Should we go back? Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper. No, I said, almost against my will. We can't leave her. We pressed on, but the path ahead was becoming harder to follow. The underbrush grew thicker, and the ground beneath our boots became more treacherous, slick with mud. I could feel the weight of something pressing down on me, like the swamp was closing in around us. The trees now towered high above, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the air was damp and cold, heavier than before. And then, I heard it. A sound, faint at first, but growing louder. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping, like nails dragging across stone. My heart stopped for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Everyone had heard it. Noah's eyes widened. "It's not just the wind." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread curling in my stomach. It's Jess. She's close." We pushed forward, but with every step, the noise grew louder, closer. It was coming from somewhere in the dense shadows ahead of us. There was no telling what it was, but I had a terrible feeling in my gut that it wasn't Jess. Suddenly, there was a sharp movement in the trees, a figure darting through the branches. My breath hitched. The silhouette was too fast, too erratic. I barely had time to react before it was gone, swallowed up by the night. "That wasn't Jess," Sam gasped, his voice trembling. "No, it wasn't," I said, my pulse racing. I could feel the blood drain from my face as a cold, creeping realization washed over me. We were no longer just looking for Jess. We were being hunted. I felt it then, a presence, something malevolent, something ancient, lurking just beyond the trees. The sound of footsteps. No, not footsteps. It was more like the dragging of something heavy across the ground, slow, deliberate. It was circling us. I wanted to call out, to scream, to demand that whatever it was show itself. But I couldn't. Something held me back, like an invisible force was pressing down on my chest, stealing my breath. "We need to move," Noah said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." We stumbled forward, the rustling sound still following us, growing louder with every step. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Was it an animal? Some kind of beast that had made its home in the swamp? But then why hadn't we heard it before? Why was it moving with such intent, such malice? The trees were closing in, the darkness so thick now that I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. The scraping sound was louder than ever, and I could hear something else now, low, guttural breathing, like the sound of something too big to be human. I turned sharply to glance at Sam, but he wasn't there. "Sam?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. Nothing. "Sam." I shouted again, my heart pounding. A soft whimper answered me, and it wasn't Sam's voice. It was something else. Something deeper, more guttural. It sounded like a creature in pain, but there was no mistaking it. It was close. My heart was racing now, panic setting in. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't even hear my own breathing over the sound of the scraping, the thudding, the low growl that seemed to rise from the ground beneath us. And then, from the shadows, something emerged. It wasn't Jess. It wasn't human. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The thing that stepped from the darkness was massive, far larger than anything I could have imagined. Its body was hunched, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes, two glowing red orbs, locked onto me, and I felt the weight of its gaze like a physical force. It was an enormous rat, but not like any rat I had ever seen. It was covered in patches of scaly, mottled fur, and its teeth glistened in the dim light as it bared them in a silent snarl. Its long tail flicked back and forth, and the scraping sound I had been hearing wasn't just its claws dragging across the ground, it was the movement of its massive form shifting through the underbrush. "Run!" Noah screamed. But there was nowhere to run. The giant rat lunged forward, and everything went black. When I awoke, I was alone. I was lying on my back, the cool, damp earth pressing into my skin. My body ached, but more than that, my mind felt warped, disoriented. The last thing I remembered was the creature lunging at me, its eyes flashing with a malevolent hunger. I had no idea how long I'd been unconscious, but the air around me felt different now. My head throbbed as I sat up, trying to make sense of everything. I looked around. The swamp was quiet. Too quiet. No sign of Noah, Sam, or Jess. The oppressive darkness seemed to press in even closer, the trees bending in strange, unnatural angles. The air was thick with moisture, but it carried an odd scent, something metallic and sour, like blood. I rose to my feet, my limbs trembling as I moved, disoriented, the world around me slipping between what felt real and what felt like a dream. My pulse raced. Was I still in the swamp, or had something changed? The edges of my vision were blurry, the world around me shifting, as though I was standing on the edge of a nightmare, watching everything around me twist and break. "Sam?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Nothing. I forced myself to take a step, then another, but each movement felt heavier than the last. It was as though the ground itself didn't want me to leave. My feet stuck to the earth, and when I looked down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The ground was covered in faint, shifting shapes, footprints, but not like any I had ever seen. They were far too large, stretched and distorted. I dropped to my knees, reaching out to touch the ground, only to retract my hand in horror. The surface beneath me was soft, almost alive, pulsing with an unnatural warmth. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, trying to regain control. But my mind refused to cooperate. I needed to find my friends. I needed to know what had happened. I tried to call out again, but my throat was dry, my voice barely a rasp. The scraping sound returned, only this time it was louder, more distinct, like something being dragged through the muck. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was closer now. Too close. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move, something large, almost blending into the darkness. It was there, in the shadows between the trees, just out of sight. I instinctively took a step back, but that only seemed to make it move faster, its outline growing clearer. It was the creature, no, creatures, plural. Several of them. And they were moving toward me. I turned and ran, adrenaline flooding my veins. Every step felt like it took me deeper into a twisted labyrinth. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like claws, grabbing at my clothes, pulling me back. I could hear the creatures behind me now, their breaths low and guttural, their claws scraping against the ground. The path ahead seemed endless, the darkness wrapping around me like a suffocating cloak. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel their eyes on me, those red, glowing eyes, burning through the blackness. And then, there was a sound, a familiar one, a voice. "Help me." I stopped in my tracks, my heart leaping into my throat. It was Jess's voice. But it sounded wrong. It was distorted, strained, as if coming from far away, as though it was echoing from some impossible place. My eyes darted around, desperately trying to locate her, but there was nothing. Just shadows. Silence. "Jess?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The voice responded again, the same desperate plea. "Help me." I felt a rush of relief mixed with terror. I wasn't alone. But the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in on all sides. I looked down, and the ground beneath me was moving, slowly, imperceptibly, as though something beneath the surface was stirring, like the earth itself was alive. I took another step forward, but then I froze. From the shadows, something emerged, something more terrible than I could have ever imagined. It was Jess, or at least, it looked like her. But her eyes were empty, hollow, and her skin was pale, stretched too thin. She was stumbling toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Her mouth opened wide, but no words came out. Only a low, haunting hiss. The creatures in the distance were closing in. There was no time left. I turned and ran again, but the world around me seemed to warp, twisting and distorting, the trees bending in impossible directions. The path ahead no longer seemed like a path, but an endless loop, pulling me deeper into the heart of the swamp, into the heart of something far worse than I could have ever imagined. The scratching noise was deafening now, the creatures closing in. I could feel the weight of their presence, like a dark cloud hovering just above me. Jess's figure lingered behind me, her silent scream echoing in my ears. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The noise. The movement. The world itself seemed to freeze. I stood there in the middle of the swamp, breathing hard, my body trembling. The creatures were gone. Jess was gone. All that was left was an eerie silence, a void that stretched out before me. But the air felt wrong. And that's when I realized it. I wasn't alone anymore. There was something else standing in the darkness, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I turned slowly, but I already knew what I would find. The creature was there, its eyes glowing red, its mouth dripping with something wet and foul. It was watching me. And this time, it wasn't alone. I had walked straight into the trap. The creatures emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixated on me. The ones I had seen earlier, monstrous shapes twisted by time, their fur matted and dark, their teeth sharp as knives. But there were more now, far more. They surrounded me in a tight circle, their breaths hot and foul. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My body was frozen, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat louder than the last. Sweat poured down my face, but my limbs felt like stone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling me deeper into its grasp. The thing that looked like Jess was still there, standing at the edge of the circle, her eyes empty. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her presence was a cold weight on my chest, an eerie reminder of everything I had failed to protect. I couldn't look at her any longer. I turned back to the creatures, my breath ragged. They were circling me now, their movements synchronized, like they were part of some twisted ritual. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, and their claws clicked together in anticipation. It wasn't just their size that terrified me. It was the feeling they radiated, something ancient and wrong, something beyond the boundaries of natural law. These weren't just animals. They were something far more dangerous. Something from a place that shouldn't exist. And then, there was a noise, a low, unsettling rumble, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. It started beneath my feet, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But the tremor spread, crawling up my legs, vibrating through my bones. The creatures paused, their heads jerking toward the ground, sniffing the air, sensing something more. I followed their gaze, my blood running cold as I saw the ground beneath me cracking open. The soil shifted, and from the depths of the earth, something began to rise. It was a shape, a form too large to comprehend, a shadow that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't understand. I had heard whispers about this, about a force buried beneath the city, something that had been waiting for the right moment to resurface. But nothing could have prepared me for this. The shadow took form, a towering, twisted figure, its body rippling with what looked like molten stone. Its face was a grotesque mask, half human, half monster, its eyes like deep wells of darkness. And beneath its feet, the earth cracked open, revealing something even worse. A vast, ancient city, lost to time. The city itself seemed to be pulsing, breathing, as though it was alive, its stone walls slick with a wet, black substance. But it wasn't just the city. It was the ground beneath it, the sky above it. Everything felt wrong, distorted, like I had stepped into a place that had never meant to be found. And standing in the midst of this ancient nightmare were the creatures, bowing before it. Their eyes were no longer glowing with hunger, but with reverence. My mind couldn't process it. I tried to move, but my legs refused to obey. I was paralyzed, staring at the scene before me, my breath catching in my throat. One of the creatures broke free from the circle and moved toward the shadowy figure. It dropped to its knees, head lowered, as if submitting to something far older and far more powerful than anything I could imagine. The ground trembled again, and I realized something horrifying. The creatures, these twisted, monstrous things, were not just predators, they were worshippers. And the thing they were worshipping was not just a creature. It was the city itself. I felt the weight of the presence behind me. The figure of Jess stood motionless, her face as empty as the void. The city seemed to call to me, pulling at my very soul, urging me to come closer. I could feel the darkness creeping into my mind, infecting my thoughts. The creatures stopped their movement, their eyes now fixed on me, as if they had waited for this moment. I had come too far. I had walked into their world. And now, there was no way out. I turned, my eyes scanning the darkness, looking for an escape, but it was useless. The creatures had closed in. The figure in the distance began to move, slowly, deliberately, with the terrible grace of something that had been waiting for centuries. It stretched out a hand, fingers long and twisted, and the very air seemed to bend around it. My heart skipped a beat as the creatures moved forward, their eyes still fixed on me, their expressions unreadable. A low hiss filled the air, and I could hear whispers, voices, coming from all around me. They were speaking in a language I didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. I was no longer the hunter. I was the prey. The figure's hand reached down, and in an instant, the world around me seemed to collapse. The shadows swallowed me whole, the creatures closing in, their teeth bared, their eyes wild with hunger. And then, everything went dark. I awoke to a familiar, distant sound, scraping. The same sound I had heard before. But this time, it was louder, closer. It seemed to echo through the tunnel of my mind, dragging me back into the place where everything had started. I was lying on the ground, the same cold earth beneath me. But it felt different now. The air was still, unnaturally still. The oppressive weight of the swamp had vanished. I opened my eyes, blinking against the dim light that filtered through the trees. And then I saw it. The city. But it wasn't the same. It was older, more twisted. It had changed since the last time I had seen it. The walls were cracked, covered in moss and darkness, and the air reeked of decay. And in the distance, I could see the creatures, their eyes glowing red, waiting. I had been here before, and I would be here again. There was no escaping it. Time had looped, and I was trapped. Trapped in a never-ending cycle, caught between the living world and the darkness beneath. The lost city had found me. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, sluggish. The fog surrounding me was thick, damp, and oppressive, clinging to my skin like a second layer. I couldn't tell if I was still in the same place, or if the world around me had shifted again, this time more subtly, more menacingly. The creatures were nowhere in sight, but their presence still lingered, heavy and suffocating. I stood, shaking off the remnants of exhaustion, my hands trembling as I pushed myself to my feet. Every inch of me screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop now. I had to escape, had to make it out, no matter the cost. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, shifting as if it, too, was alive. The city, no, it wasn't a city anymore. It was a prison, a trap meant to ensnare souls, to erase them from existence. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the sky overhead was an unnatural gray, as though the sun had never truly shone in this place. I turned in circles, scanning for any sign of life, any escape. But there was nothing. The trees around me stood like ancient sentinels, their twisted branches blocking out the sky. And then, there it was. A flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. I froze. In the distance, a figure moved among the ruins, its form too familiar. It was Jess, at least it looked like her. But there was no way she could be alive. She had disappeared when I first found this place, lost to the depths of the city. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her approach, her steps slow, deliberate, as though she was drawn to me by some unseen force. Jess? I called, my voice hoarse. But she didn't answer. She didn't even look at me. I stepped forward, my legs feeling like lead, the weight of my own body threatening to pull me back to the ground. The closer I got, the more I realized something was horribly wrong. Her skin was pale, unnaturally so, her eyes glazed and unseeing. She was moving, but she wasn't alive. And then, I saw it. Behind her, shadowed figures emerged from the mist, stepping out from the ruins, their bodies hulking and monstrous. The creatures. But these weren't the same ones I had seen earlier. No, these were different, darker, more twisted. Their eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their mouths dripped with something that looked like venom. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs locked in place as the creatures advanced, closing in from all sides. Jess, or what was left of her, was now standing completely still, her arms raised in an unnatural position, as though she were part of the landscape, part of the nightmare that had overtaken this place. The creatures surrounded her, circling like vultures. And then, as if on command, they stopped, their eyes fixed on me once more. There was a terrible, suffocating silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, one of the creatures took a step forward, its eyes locked onto mine, a deep growl rumbling from its chest. My heart slammed against my ribs, each beat echoing like a death knell. The ground beneath me trembled again, the tremor rolling through my body like a shockwave. It was the city. The city was alive, reacting to me, to my presence, to my fear. The walls groaned, and the creatures snarled as the shadows seemed to deepen, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. I was trapped. I was trapped in a cycle. This place had no end, no beginning. It was a loop. The lost city had claimed me, and I was its prisoner. There was no escape. The creature in front of me took another step. I didn't dare move, too terrified to even blink. But something strange began to happen. The air around me started to grow cold, colder than I had ever felt. It was as though time itself had frozen and the world had stopped turning. The creature's growl turned into something else, a voice. A low, echoing whisper that seemed to come from deep within the earth, from the very foundation of the city. "You can never leave," it hissed, its words slithering through my mind like venom. "You are part of us now." I felt the weight of the words settle in my chest, a crushing force that made it harder and harder to breathe. My thoughts were clouded, my mind slipping into the abyss of hopelessness. The creatures closed in, their glowing eyes burning through the darkness. And then, as if everything had happened at once, the world around me shattered. The sky cracked open, and from the rift emerged the towering figure, the one I had seen before. The shadow that ruled over this place. It stretched toward me, its form impossibly large, as though it were made of the very darkness itself. Its eyes were cold and endless, and in them I saw everything I had lost, everything I had tried to escape. The creatures fell silent as the figure reached down, its fingers long and gnarled, like branches of a tree twisted by years of decay. It was the city itself. I had walked into its trap. And now, there would be no escape. The shadow wrapped around me, pulling me toward the ground, its cold touch seeping into my bones. I gasped for air, but there was none to breathe. I was drowning, sinking deeper into the city's grasp, until everything, my thoughts, my body, my soul, was consumed by the darkness. And then, there was nothing. No city. No creatures. No Jess. Just a void. A vast, empty space where time and reality had no meaning. The lost city had claimed me, and it would never let me go. The monster in the car. We had been driving for hours. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, painting the endless Texan desert in hues of orange and red. My wife, Sarah, sat beside me, scrolling through her phone, the only sound the hum of the tires against the road. We were miles away from the nearest town, just a stretch of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape, and the air had a strange, heavy stillness to it. "Another hour, maybe two, and we'll be there," I said, breaking the silence, glancing over at her. "Sounds good," she replied absently, her eyes fixed on the screen. I glanced at the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the darkening road behind us. There was nothing. Just the endless stretch of highway, the desert on either side, and the slowly dimming light. A perfect, empty void. But then, something caught my attention. A sound. At first, it was so faint I thought I imagined it. Like a soft scraping noise, almost like the wind, but not quite. I looked in the mirror again. Nothing. Just the empty road. "I thought I heard something," I said, my voice tight. "What?" Sarah looked up, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" It sounded like something dragging along the ground. Behind us. She shrugged, looking out the window. "It's probably just some animal or debris getting blown around. There's nothing out here." Maybe she was right. But something about the sound didn't sit well with me. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching the darkness slowly creep in, hoping it was nothing more than the wind. But then I heard it again. A soft scraping sound. Closer this time. I reached for the volume knob, turning the radio up to drown out the noise. The static hissed for a moment before the announcer's voice cut through the air. "We're coming up on a storm front, folks. Stay tuned for updates," the radio said. I didn't hear the rest of the message. My heart had started racing, a primal instinct rising in me. That sound, it was getting closer. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice sharper now. Sarah nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "It's probably just the wind, or an animal. Don't freak out, okay?" But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to focus on the road ahead, pushing the fear down, telling myself it was nothing. But the scraping continued, drawing closer, until it was unmistakable, a slow, deliberate dragging sound that felt like it was right behind us. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What the hell is that?" I muttered under my breath. Sarah was looking out the side window now, her face pale. She squinted into the distance, as if searching for something. "It's so quiet out here," she said. "There's nothing." And then, just as I was about to ask her what she meant, I saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of my vision, but then it moved. Something large, dark, and fast, crossing the road behind us, too fast to be an animal. It wasn't a car, there was no light, no reflection. Just a shape moving, stretching unnaturally across the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, panic in her voice. I couldn't answer. I was frozen, staring at the empty road behind us. The shadow had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But the dragging noise, soft, menacing, continued. I looked again. Nothing. But that feeling, it was there. The air was thick, suffocating, like something was watching us. Something waiting. "Maybe it's just the heat playing tricks on you," Sarah said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the tremor in her voice now. "No," I said, my eyes scanning the horizon. "Something's wrong. We need to get off the road." I didn't care about the storm anymore. I just needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere with people. But the road ahead was endless, the stretch of highway vanishing into the darkening desert. There was nowhere to turn off. Nowhere to stop. The dragging sound came again. It was so close now I could almost feel the vibrations under the car, like something massive was following us, moving just out of sight. I glanced at Sarah. She was staring straight ahead, her breath shallow. I think we should stop," she whispered. I didn't argue. I slammed the car into the shoulder of the road, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. The engine sputtered and then died, leaving us in eerie silence. We sat there, motionless. The scraping sound stopped. But then, there was something else. A soft, wet thudding noise. Like something heavy hitting the ground. Step by step, it came closer, dragging itself along the pavement. The silence around us was suffocating, the world shrinking down to that one sound. Thud. 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 I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "What the hell is that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I reached for the keys, but then I heard something worse, a low growl, just beyond the reach of the headlights. A sound too deep to be from any animal I knew. A sound that made my skin crawl, like it was coming from the very earth itself. I turned to Sarah. "We need to go. Now." But when I tried to start the car, the engine sputtered again and died. The thudding grew louder, closer, and I knew then that whatever it was, it wasn't going to let us go. The silence was deafening. I stared at the dashboard, frantically twisting the key, but the engine refused to start. The headlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the empty desert. My heart pounded in my chest, matching the thudding sound that was growing nearer. The growl, low and rumbling, came from the same direction, straight ahead, where the darkness seemed to pulse and ripple. It felt like the whole world was closing in on us. I turned to Sarah. Her face was pale, her wide eyes locked on the road ahead, where the shadows seemed to gather, thickening and shifting with every passing second. Her lips trembled, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We both knew that whatever was out there was no ordinary threat. I twisted the key again, more desperate now. The engine coughed and spluttered but refused to turn over. "What is it, Dan?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, like speaking too loudly might provoke whatever it was that waited just beyond our sight. "I don't know," I said, my voice cracking. "But we need to get out of here." The thudding stopped. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement. It felt like time had frozen. My fingers trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, listening for any hint of movement. Every muscle in my body was tense, primed for flight. But there was nowhere to run. The road stretched on, empty and barren, with nothing but the desert in every direction. Then I heard it, a sharp, skittering sound, like nails dragging over gravel, and it came from directly behind us. I whipped my head around, eyes straining in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a pair of gleaming eyes, reflecting in the fading light. But when I blinked, it was gone. "Dan!" Sarah gasped, grabbing my arm. "Look!" I turned back to the front, my breath catching in my throat. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the headlights, I saw something move, a shadow, stretching and warping like it was too large for the space it occupied. It seemed to slither across the ground, a huge, dark mass that shifted unnaturally, too quick to be anything natural. "What the hell is that?" I muttered, my throat tight. But even as I spoke, the shadow seemed to pulse, its shape changing. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, breathing. And then it moved closer, faster than anything should have been able to. I slammed the car into reverse, hoping to put some distance between us and whatever that thing was. The tires screeched, kicking up dust as we shot backward along the highway. But just as quickly as I moved, the headlights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The sound, scraping, dragging, returned, now mixed with the unmistakable crunch of something heavy crawling across the ground. It was closer. Much closer. "Dan!" Sarah screamed, her voice filled with panic. I could barely hear her over the rising noise, the growl, the scraping, the thudding. Something was moving under the car, something huge. It was as if the earth itself was alive, shifting, swallowing us whole. I reached for the door handle, my mind racing, trying to think. "We have to run." I shouted, my voice raw with fear. "Get out of the car, now!" But as I swung open the door, I froze. A shadow, not far from the car, shifted again. This time, it wasn't just an outline. I could see something more large, twisted, with eyes that glowed like twin orbs in the darkness. A cold chill ran down my spine. The creature was real. It was here. And it was closing in. I pulled Sarah by the arm, forcing her to her feet, but as we stepped into the dirt beside the car, I heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal. I spun around, heart in my throat. The creature was right behind us. The first thing I noticed were its eyes, yellow, gleaming like they were burning holes through the night. Its body was a mass of shadows, stretched and warped as if it didn't belong in this world. A massive, crawling thing, it seemed to move with impossible speed, its limbs long and spindly, dragging along the ground like it was part of the earth itself. I barely had time to react before the thing lunged, its maw opening wide, filled with rows of jagged, glistening teeth. I shoved Sarah out of the way, grabbing her and throwing her behind a nearby rock, my heart racing. "Stay down," I hissed, my breath ragged. The creature hissed, its voice a guttural, rasping sound, and then it turned toward me. For a moment, time seemed to slow. I could feel its eyes on me, its presence pressing against me like a physical force. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something. But all I could do was stand there, frozen in terror, my body screaming for escape. The thing was close now. I could see the dripping saliva hanging from its mouth, the gnashing teeth. "Dan, no!" Sarah's voice came from behind me, but I couldn't look away from the creature. In that moment, something primal in me took over. I turned and bolted, running into the dark, the thudding sound of its massive legs pounding behind me, each step closer, faster, until I felt its hot breath on my neck. But just as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Its shadow was multiplying, splitting off into smaller figures, all moving toward us. We were surrounded. I didn't know how long I'd been running, minutes, hours, or maybe seconds. Time blurred into one frantic pulse of survival. I could feel the ground beneath me shifting with every pounding step, but the world around me was dark and indistinct, swallowed by the night. The only thing I could focus on was the sound, the relentless scraping, the bone-chilling growl, and the gnashing of teeth that echoed through the air. I could hear Sarah's breath, ragged and desperate, close behind me. But I didn't dare look back. Every ounce of my body screamed to run, to get away from those things, from whatever horror was now chasing us. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I pushed my legs to move, I felt as if the shadows were closing in around me. I heard her stumble, just a small sound, a gasp of pain, but it cut through the noise of my racing heart. "Sarah!" I shouted, spinning around. She was on the ground, clutching her ankle, eyes wide with terror. I could see the fear in her face, the desperation in her gaze, but I couldn't stop. I knew I couldn't. The growl from behind us was growing louder, closer. The ground shook with every step of the creature, or creatures, moving in on us. I reached down, grabbed Sarah's arm, and yanked her to her feet, ignoring the screams of pain that slipped from her lips. She stumbled, but I didn't have time to help her. We were both targets now, and I could feel the monster's hunger in the air, closing in. "We need to keep moving," I gasped, pulling her along, each step feeling heavier than the last. But it didn't matter how fast we ran. The shadows were everywhere. They were no longer just behind us, they were around us, closing in from all sides. Figures moved in the darkness, shadows that stretched unnaturally, warping and flickering like they weren't bound by the rules of the world. I could hear their claws scraping against the earth, each step getting closer. And then I saw it, a shape darting out of the corner of my eye. My heart skipped in my chest. One of them was right there, barely a few feet away, its gleaming eyes locked on us. A chill ran down my spine. "Sarah, we can't outrun them." My voice was harsh, panic threading through my words. We had reached a small hill, the ground sloping upward into jagged rocks. There was nowhere to go, no shelter, no safety. We were exposed. I dragged Sarah toward the rocks, pushing her ahead of me as I scanned the area for any sign of an escape. But the creatures were everywhere, now surrounding us. Their eyes reflected in the darkness, dozens of them, circling us like predators closing in on their prey. Sarah was breathing heavily, clutching her ankle with one hand while the other gripped my arm tightly. "Dan, what are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Her eyes were wild, scanning the night for any possible escape. I didn't know. I didn't have an answer. I just knew that the air around us was thick with terror, and we weren't going to survive if we didn't act fast. Then, as if on cue, the growl came again, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the air. My whole body froze. The creature was closer than I thought, its massive form emerging from the shadows just ahead of us. It was enormous, its twisted body a mass of shifting darkness, its yellow eyes glowing in the night like twin lanterns. Behind it, I could see others emerging, their eyes catching the dim light, their bodies creeping forward. We were trapped. "Dan, please," Sarah's voice was barely audible, but I could feel her grip tightening on my arm. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't afford to be distracted. We were surrounded, and the monsters were closing in, their movements precise and calculated. They were toying with us, like a cat with a mouse, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then I saw it. A small crack in the rocks, barely noticeable in the darkness, but enough for us to slip through. It was our only chance. "Sarah, over here!" I shouted, pulling her toward the narrow opening in the rocks. But before we could reach it, a clawed hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing my arm with unyielding force. I screamed in pain, trying to break free, but the creature's grip was like iron. It dragged me toward it, its eyes glinting with malevolent hunger. "Dan!" Sarah screamed, but I couldn't answer. I was being pulled into the darkness, into the thing's mouth, where its jagged teeth waited. I fought with everything I had, my body twisting, my hands scrabbling against the ground for purchase, but it was no use. The creature was stronger, faster. And then, in that moment of final terror, I heard it, Sarah's scream, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. I had no time to react. The creature's maw opened wide, its hot breath on my face, and then everything went black. The darkness swallowed me whole. There was no sound, no sensation, just a deafening silence that pressed in from all sides, like I was drowning in an endless void. My mind felt slow, disjointed, as if I were floating between worlds, half alive, half dead. I couldn't feel my body anymore, couldn't remember how I had gotten here or what had happened. I was trapped. I tried to open my eyes, but they wouldn't obey me. Every time I tried to move, to scream, my body felt like it was held down by an unseen force, too heavy to lift. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like I was buried alive under miles of earth. The only thing that broke through the darkness was that same growl, the terrible sound that had haunted me, the sound of the creature that had been hunting us. But now, there was something else, something worse. It was a whisper, a voice so soft, so faint, that it was barely there. It slid into my mind, like a snake slipping through the cracks in a wall. "Dan." It called my name, the sound dripping with malice. "You thought you could escape." I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, constricted. The whispering grew louder, sharper. I could almost feel the cold breath of whatever was speaking, crawling into my ears, sinking into my very thoughts. It wasn't just a creature anymore. It was something far worse. Something that could reach into the depths of my soul. Dan, the voice continued, sending a chill down my spine. You failed. And now, you're mine. The ground beneath me shifted, and the sensation of falling overtook me. My stomach lurched as if I were tumbling through a dark void, spinning faster and faster. I couldn't catch my breath. The air felt wrong, thick with the stench of rot, like something long dead. My heart hammered against my chest, my pulse a frantic rhythm that matched the horrible whispers in my ears. Then, with a sickening jolt, my body hit the ground. I gasped for air, my eyes snapping open. The world around me was a blur, gray, indistinct shapes that merged and warped as if the very fabric of reality was breaking apart. The darkness clung to everything, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating blanket. I was on my hands and knees, shaking, gasping for breath, but the air tasted foul, filled with something rancid, like decay. And then, slowly, the shapes began to form. I could see them, figures moving in the dark. Tall, twisted, and hunched. Their eyes were glowing, faint but unmistakable, gleaming like fireflies in the pitch blackness. I couldn't make out their full forms, but the way they moved, the way their heads swiveled in impossible angles, made my skin crawl. I tried to stand, to move, but my legs felt weak, as though they no longer belonged to me. My mind screamed for me to escape, but my body refused to listen. Then I heard it again, the sound of Sarah's voice. But it wasn't real. It couldn't be. Dan, help me, please. I whipped my head around, searching the darkness for her, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Only the creatures, those things that were circling me, moving closer, their glowing eyes locked onto me. They were waiting, toying with me like the last moments of a dying animal. No, I muttered, feeling the weight of despair pressing on me. This can't be real. But it was. I could feel their presence, feel their eyes boring into me, their hunger seeping into my bones. And then I realized this was where we were meant to be. The creatures, the shadows, the whispers, it was all a trap, a twisted game that we had been brought into without even knowing it. I tried to run again, but my feet were rooted to the ground. I couldn't move. The monsters were coming closer now, their forms becoming clearer in the oppressive darkness. Their twisted bodies were unnatural, with long limbs and jagged claws that scraped against the stone floor. One of them stepped forward, its breath hot against my neck. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me, like it was drawing every ounce of life out of me. Dan. It whispered, its voice low and guttural. You should have stayed in the car. And then, I realized. It knew me. It knew my thoughts, my fears, my deepest regrets. Everything I had done, every choice I had made, it was all leading me to this moment. There was no escaping this nightmare. With that thought, a scream tore from my throat. I fought, I clawed at the darkness, but the creatures surrounded me, their cold hands wrapping around me, dragging me into the suffocating blackness. And then, everything went silent. I don't know how long I was lost in that void. Time felt irrelevant, twisted and warped by the darkness that consumed me. My body was no longer mine, my thoughts a fractured puzzle. The whispering voices surrounded me, filling every corner of my mind with dread. It was as though I was falling, endlessly, into something far deeper than just the earth beneath me. I had lost all sense of where I was, or if I even existed anymore. And then, in the oppressive silence that followed the chaos, I felt it, a tug, deep in my chest. A memory, faint but undeniable, flickered to life. Sarah. Her face, her smile, flashed before my eyes like a dying ember, and a surge of panic shot through me. I couldn't remember when I'd last seen her, or how long we had been apart, but in that instant, I knew I had to get back to her. I had to save her. My heart pounded in my ears as I struggled to move, my limbs still heavy and unresponsive, as if they were fighting against me. But this time, there was something different. I could feel the pull of her, feel her presence, faint but real, like a thread tying me to the surface of some horrible nightmare. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I forced myself to stand. My legs trembled beneath me, but I refused to fall. I had to keep moving, keep fighting, no matter how impossible it felt. The darkness around me seemed to shrink back as I moved, but it was replaced by something worse, something close. I turned, half blind, and saw the eyes again. Those glowing eyes. Hundreds of them, flickering in the dark, watching me with an insatiable hunger. The creatures were closing in, their skeletal limbs bending in unnatural ways, their breaths heavy and sickening. I could hear their claws scraping across the ground, each movement sending a shiver of dread through me. But still, I pressed forward. I stumbled, my steps unsteady, but my determination stronger than the fear trying to paralyze me. The whispering voices grew louder, drowning out everything else. "You can't escape," they hissed. "You're ours now." But I refused to listen. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to survive this. I pushed myself harder, my hands scraping against the rough walls, my legs burning with every step. And then, finally, I saw it. A faint light, just a flicker at first, but real. I was so close. The creatures, the eyes, they seemed to hesitate for a moment, and I could feel the shift in the air. The pressure was gone, replaced by something else, something worse. A low rumble echoed through the ground. It shook the very walls around me. The ground beneath my feet cracked, splintering, as if the earth itself was splitting apart. I tried to run faster, but the world was crumbling around me, the darkness stretching its fingers to pull me back. The ground beneath me gave way. And then, in a split second, I was falling. Falling. I could see the light, closer now, but too far to reach. The darkness grabbed at me, pulling me deeper, faster. The creatures were there, at the edge of the abyss, watching me as I plummeted into the void. I tried to scream, but the air was gone, swallowed by the depth of the darkness. I tried to fight, but my body was numb, too far gone. And then, there was nothing. Silence. I don't know how long it lasted, seconds, minutes, hours, but the void was gone. The crushing weight, the whispers, the creatures, gone. But I was not alone. I opened my eyes. The light was blinding. It was the harsh, white light of headlights. A car. Sarah's car. I could feel the warmth of the seat beneath me, the familiarity of the interior. But the world outside the windows was wrong. The road, the landscape, it was familiar, but twisted. The trees stretched too tall, their limbs reaching for the sky like gnarled fingers. The sky above was dark, bruised purple, heavy with the weight of an unseen storm. And then I heard it, the growl. Low, menacing, like it had been following us all along. I looked over to the passenger seat, where Sarah should have been. But she wasn't there. The seat was empty, save for a single, long claw mark scratched deep into the leather. The growl came again, closer now, as though it had followed us here, through the darkness, through the nightmare. I slammed my foot on the gas, my heart pounding in my chest. The car lurched forward, but the road stretched endlessly ahead, a never-ending path. I looked in the rearview mirror, hoping, praying that I was wrong. But I wasn't. The shadow in the mirror was real. It was there, watching me, its glowing eyes peering through the darkness. The creature. It had followed me here. And just like that, I realized something. There was no escaping it. No matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I tried to outrun it, it was always with me. The growl rumbled again, deafening now, and in that final, terrible moment, I knew. The monster in the car was no longer just a thing of the darkness. It was me. It was inside me, always waiting, always hunting. And as I heard the scream, faint but unmistakable, it was Sarah's voice, calling from somewhere far behind. But it was too late. Black hour. I often wondered how things would change once the city lights went out. How quickly would people stop pretending to be busy, stop hiding behind their digital distractions? How long before the fear settled in, creeping through their veins as the weight of silence hung over them? But there was one thing I hadn't expected, how quickly the dark itself would start to change. I was on my usual night shift in the subway tunnels under New York City, working as a maintenance supervisor. The trains had stopped running for the night, and it was just the hum of lights above and the occasional rumble in the distance. The sort of peaceful, eerie silence that had become a strange companion over the years. I had been in these tunnels for long enough to get used to the strange sounds, the metallic groans of the old tracks, the occasional drip of water from leaking pipes, and the scurrying of rats that had claimed these underground passages as their home. The rats were everywhere, their eyes flashing in the dim light like tiny stars in the darkness, moving in and out of shadows. But tonight was different. Something in the air felt thicker. The usual hum of the city above seemed muffled, as if the weight of the night was pressing down harder than usual. I chalked it up to exhaustion, to the slow creep of fatigue that comes from too many hours spent underground. But then, I heard it, a sound that wasn't quite right. It was a faint rustling, far deeper in the tunnel than I could see. At first, I thought it was just another rat or maybe a loose piece of metal shifting. But the sound grew louder, clearer, closer. It wasn't just a random shuffle. It was deliberate, methodical. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly 2 in the morning. No one was supposed to be down here at this hour. No trains, no workers. Just me, alone in the silence, listening to the creeping darkness. The rustling continued, growing more pronounced, and something inside me tensed. My heart picked up its pace, but I tried to shake off the unease. It had to be something mundane. A rat. A piece of garbage blowing down the tracks. There was no reason to get worked up. But as I walked down the tunnel, the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should have, curling and twisting as if alive. I had felt it, a coldness creeping across the back of my neck, making the hairs stand up. The darkness wasn't just empty space anymore. It was pressing against me, suffocating, like it was growing thicker, more tangible. And then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes in the distance. They gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the weak light from the ceiling above, but they weren't like the usual glint of rat eyes. These were larger, more intense, and they didn't blink. They just stared, unblinking and watching. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to step forward. Probably just another rat, I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself. But as I got closer, the eyes didn't move. They remained fixed on me, unmoving. And then the sound came again, clear this time. A low, drawn-out scrape against metal, like claws dragging across the rails. I froze. That wasn't a rat. It was something much larger. Suddenly, I heard more sounds. There was no mistaking it now. Several pairs of eyes, all gleaming, were following me in the dark. The shadows shifted and stretched, twisting into figures too large to be rats, too humanoid to be anything I could explain. The scraping sound grew louder, more insistent, like a dozen sets of claws dragging along the floor in pursuit of me. I turned to run. My feet pounded the concrete floor, the echoes of my steps bouncing off the walls, but I could feel them behind me. Their movement was fluid, unsettling, like something both animal and unnatural at once. I looked over my shoulder. There, at the edge of the light, I saw a massive shadow dart across the wall, far too large to be anything I could comprehend. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The clattering of feet, no, claws, grew closer, and I could hear the heavy thud of something heavy and fast gaining on me. Panic surged through my chest as the shadows continued to stalk me, their eyes gleaming like tiny stars in the dark. I reached the service door, fumbling for my key. My hands were shaking, my mind screaming at me to hurry. Finally, the door clicked open, and I threw myself inside. But the door didn't close fast enough. A massive, clawed hand, no, more than one, slid through the crack just before I slammed it shut. The sheer force pushed the door back, and I felt something cold and wet brush against my skin. I locked the door, my heart racing as I backed away. I could hear them on the other side, scraping, clicking, and growling softly. But it was the eyes that haunted me. The way they gleamed in the dark, unblinking, knowing. Something was in those tunnels. And I had no idea what it wanted. Or what it would do. It wasn't just rats anymore. This was something else. And whatever it was hunting me. The door had barely held. The thuds and scrapes on the other side only grew louder, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. The room I had locked myself into was small, just a utility closet, hardly big enough to fit a full-grown man, let alone provide any real protection. I pressed my back against the cold metal door, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The air smelled stale, thick with the musk of oil and old machinery. But above it, there was something else, a strange, sharp tang that cut through the otherwise familiar scent of the tunnels. A bitter, metallic odor I couldn't place, but it made my stomach churn. The growls from the other side were growing louder, more frantic, as though whatever was waiting outside was getting closer, and yet I couldn't bring myself to open the door. I stared at the crack where the light filtered in, my eyes glued to the sliver of space, praying it would remain shut. What the hell was that thing? Those weren't just rats. They were far too big, too organized. I could hear their claws scratching at the floor, dragging across metal in a way that felt deliberate. Each scrape was like a needle pushing deeper into my brain. It was like they were trying to communicate, no, like they were trying to find me. I forced my hand to my radio, but when I pressed the button, all I heard was static. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. There was no connection down here, none of the usual comms between the maintenance crew. I was completely isolated. Alone. But then, I heard it again. A whisper. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. Help. It wasn't my imagination. I was sure of it. The voice was deep and distorted, as if it was coming from far below the ground. A low rumble of static mixed with the words, making it impossible to discern who it was, but the desperation in the plea was clear. I clenched my fists. Someone else was down here, someone who had heard what I had. Or worse, someone who had seen what I'd seen. I wanted to shout into the radio, but something in my gut told me it would do no good. The voice had already vanished, swallowed by the growing sound of scraping claws on metal. I stood, motionless, trying to steady my breath. The sound from outside was getting closer, dragging its way down the tunnel. Another shadow flickered past the narrow crack beneath the door. Too large. Too fast. The darkness was closing in on me, and there was no way to outrun it. I needed to find a way out. I scanned the closet, but there was nothing useful. No tools, no other exits. Just pipes and old maintenance equipment that might as well have been part of the floor at this point. I could hear the creatures, whatever they were, moving outside now, circling the room. They were toying with me, just waiting for me to make a mistake. There was a vent in the far corner of the closet, too small for anything larger than a rat to crawl through, but maybe I could fit. Maybe I could escape through it and find a way to the surface. I crawled toward it, my hand shaking as I moved over the dirty floor. I took a deep breath, trying to focus, and yanked at the grill with all my strength. It came off with a screeching noise, and I froze. It was too loud, too obvious. But I couldn't stop now. I crawled through the narrow hole, feeling the metal edges cut into my skin. The sounds from outside grew frantic, closer, and I had no doubt they knew exactly where I was. The sharp scrape of claws on metal had turned into a steady rhythm, almost like a countdown. I reached the other side, my heart hammering in my chest. The air was cooler here, and I could see dim shapes moving in the dark ahead of me, but I didn't stop to analyze them. I kept crawling forward, desperate to put distance between me and whatever was hunting me. But the tunnel stretched on, endless, winding deeper into the earth. The further I crawled, the more the air seemed to thicken. It was as if the walls were closing in, compressing, making it harder to breathe. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, I heard a faint sound. A footstep, barely audible. A shuffling sound, soft but unmistakable. I looked back. Two glowing eyes blinked in the dark behind me, just far enough to remain hidden in the shadows, but I could feel their gaze on me. The creatures were right there, so close I could almost hear their breath, thick and rattling. But what chilled me the most wasn't the eyes. It was the unmistakable sound of something crawling toward me, its claws clicking softly on the metal floor. It was too slow to be the others. This one was different. And it was coming closer. I didn't wait. I crawled faster, my movements erratic, pushing forward with all the strength I could muster. Every nerve in my body screamed to stop, to turn back, to find another way, but I couldn't. The things were closing in, and the darkness felt alive. The walls were shifting, tightening around me as though they were pushing me towards something far worse. Then I saw it. A dim light in the distance, faint but real. A way out. Or so I thought. But as I pushed forward, a shape appeared in the light. A towering figure. It wasn't a rat. It was something else. Something far worse. It stared at me, and in its eyes, I saw the same reflection, my own fear, mirrored back at me. And then it moved. I froze. The creature's eyes, those glowing orbs, stared back at me, unblinking, unfeeling. It stood perfectly still, its massive form barely visible in the dim light that flickered ahead of me. The air around us felt thick, suffocating. The walls of the tunnel, the same cold, metallic surfaces I had grown used to, seemed to press in, drawing the darkness closer. I should have turned around. I should have gone back. But there was nowhere to go. The creature was blocking the only way out. For a moment, I thought my heart had stopped. The creature's body was too large, too dark, to make sense of in the dim light. It looked almost like a giant rodent, but its shape was too distorted. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its back arched in an eerie, almost predatory way. The size of it was what shook me most. It wasn't just a rat, it was a monster. It moved. One step forward, then another. Slow, deliberate, its claws scraping against the concrete floor with a sharp, unsettling screech. I barely had time to react before the first one appeared from the shadows behind me. The darkness had become its ally. They were closing in on me. My chest tightened, panic flooding my veins as I realized they had been surrounding me for a while. They were too many. Too quick. I turned back, scrambling on my hands and knees, trying to escape, but the tunnel was a maze. It was too narrow for me to turn and run, and behind me, I could hear them, more than one, crawling, scuttling, hunting. I stumbled forward, my breath ragged and panicked, every step I took echoing through the empty corridor, reverberating off the walls. I couldn't hear anything else but the sound of claws clicking closer and closer, their pursuit a constant, gnawing presence in the back of my mind. I glanced back, my heart leaping into my throat. The first creature was close, so close I could almost feel the heat of its breath, the stench of rot in the air. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, flickering like dying stars. There was something intelligent behind those eyes, something malevolent and purposeful. I had no choice but to keep moving, to keep crawling, to keep fighting the overwhelming urge to freeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all futile. The air was becoming heavier, each breath harder to take. It wasn't just the darkness closing in on me, it was the silence. For the first time since I had arrived here, there was no sound. No claws, no scrapes, no growls. Just that oppressive stillness. It felt wrong. Suddenly, I heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear, like a voice through water. "Don't run." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was deep, like the rumble of a storm coming from far below the earth. It sounded familiar. I turned toward the source of the voice. There, in the shadowy depths ahead, I could see another set of glowing eyes. A different set. A third. This time, I didn't move. I couldn't. It was too late. The creatures surrounded me. Their eyes glowed, their forms shifting in the dark like twisted, warped reflections of the shadows. Their bodies were impossibly long, their limbs unnaturally thin, and they seemed to melt into the darkness around them, becoming one with it. The first one I had seen was the leader. The others, smaller but just as terrifying, followed its movement like puppets on strings. I couldn't think, couldn't move. The darkness swallowed everything, my thoughts, my breath, my very soul. A sharp, sickening click echoed through the tunnel, and then another. The creatures were getting closer, their shadows stretching and merging into one until I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. And then, as the first creature stepped forward, it spoke. I've been waiting for you. I could feel my knees shaking, but I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And then it clicked again. The sound was deafening, the vibrations echoing in my chest. And before I could understand what was happening, the creature lunged at me, its claws extended, its fangs gleaming in the dark. I screamed, but the scream was cut short. Its claws sank deep into my flesh, dragging me backward into the darkness. I felt its breath on my skin, hot and rancid. I could see the twisted shape of its face looming closer, its eyes burning with hunger. And then, nothing. Darkness. I woke up to the sound of silence. It was the kind of silence that presses in from all sides, suffocating, as though the very air around me had become thick with the weight of something unseen. I didn't know where I was at first. The last thing I remembered was the sharp sting of claws tearing into my flesh, the feel of the creature's hot breath on my face. But now, there was nothing. No creatures. No shadows. No glowing eyes. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond, like I was anchored to the ground by an unseen force. Every muscle was stiff, aching. My heart was pounding, but even that seemed muffled, as if the beat itself were coming from far away. I could barely catch my breath. The dark around me seemed endless. I didn't know how long I had been lying there, but eventually my senses began to come back to me. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It was so cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt before, like the temperature of a place that had never known warmth. I tried to lift my arm, but it felt heavy, unnatural. When I finally managed to open my eyes, I saw nothing but pure blackness, absolute darkness stretching out in all directions. I was lying on something solid, stone, concrete. I couldn't tell. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My throat was raw, dry. My mouth felt like I had swallowed sand. Something was wrong. So wrong. I pushed myself up, using every ounce of strength I had, until I was sitting up in the darkness. My mind raced, the memories of what had happened rushing back to me in a chaotic blur. The creatures. The glowing eyes. The feeling of their claws sinking into my flesh. Was it a dream? No, it couldn't have been. This place felt too real. The oppressive silence, the cold, the weight of the air, it was all too real. I had to get out. The problem was, I had no idea where I was. I stood up shakily, my legs barely supporting my weight. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't afford to panic. Not now. I had to focus. I took a cautious step forward, the sound of my shoes scraping against the stone floor loud in the silence. Every step echoed. I was in some kind of vast, empty space. I couldn't see a thing, but the darkness seemed to pulse around me, alive in some way I couldn't explain. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something, anything. A noise. A sign of life. Nothing. I felt it then, the weight of something following me. I wasn't alone. I was never alone. The shadows moved in the corner of my vision. A flicker, a shift in the darkness. It was subtle at first, but I could feel it. It was like the shadows themselves were watching me, waiting for me to move, to make a mistake. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I stood completely still, hoping that whatever it was, whatever was stalking me, wouldn't notice me. The dark pressed in from all sides, suffocating, swallowing every ounce of light. I had no idea how long I stood there, waiting. My body trembled, my skin crawling. But the darkness remained still, silent. I took another step, then another. Slowly, cautiously, like a hunted animal trying to avoid detection. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something was closing in on me. It came without warning. A soft shuffle of movement. A click. A faint rustle in the shadows. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature was there. I saw the gleam of its eyes in the darkness, those terrible, gleaming eyes that seemed to pierce through the night, watching, calculating. It was here. I didn't wait. I ran. I ran blindly, faster than I thought I could move. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the endless black, but there was something else. Something worse. The clicking. It was louder now, a sharp rhythm that grew faster, more frantic. I could hear the creature moving after me, its steps closing in. But the darkness seemed to be shifting too. The walls, the floor, nothing was staying the same. It was all warping, bending in unnatural ways. The air around me thickened, became harder to breathe. Was this a dream? I couldn't think. I couldn't stop. I just had to keep running, had to escape whatever nightmare was closing in on me. Then, thud, I hit something. I fell, hard, my body slamming into the ground. My head struck the stone with a sickening crack, sending a jolt of pain through my skull. I tried to push myself up, but I couldn't. My limbs were heavy, unresponsive. And then, through the haze of pain, I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first. Almost soothing. Don't run. I looked up, but there was nothing. Just darkness. But I could feel it now. It was right there. It was closing in on me. I could hear it moving, feel the weight of it in the air. It was too late. Before I could react, the creature was on me. Its claws raked through the air like knives, and I felt them digging into my skin, pulling me into the dark. I couldn't scream. I couldn't fight back. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was a pair of glowing eyes. And then, nothing. When I woke up again, it was different. I could feel the weight of the air around me, oppressive and thick, but this time I wasn't in the same void of darkness. I was somewhere else. The cold was still there, but it felt more contained, more manageable, like I was in a small, confined space. My limbs were still heavy, my head still throbbing, but something inside me told me to move. So I did, pushing myself up from the cold, damp floor beneath me. I wasn't alone. I could feel them in the shadows, watching, waiting. The creatures. The same ones that had been chasing me before, only now they felt different. More real. More present. I tried to get my bearings, but the darkness still enveloped everything. I couldn't see anything clearly. The shapes around me seemed to blur, shifting with every blink of my eyes. The silence was maddening. It pressed against my eardrums, filling my head with the pounding rhythm of my own heartbeat. I took a slow, cautious step forward, the sound of my breath sharp in the stillness. I was still in the tunnels. I recognized the layout from before, the low ceiling, the jagged walls, the oppressive sense of confinement. But there was something more to this place now. It felt wrong. Like the very ground beneath me was alive, and not in the way I remembered. I moved cautiously, hoping for a glimpse of light, a break in the darkness, but there was nothing. No way out. Just the sound of my own footsteps and the deep, echoing silence. I stopped. I could hear them again. The soft shuffle of movement, the quiet click of claws against stone. It was close. Too close. I forced myself to stay still, my heart hammering in my chest as I listened. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel the creatures moving, drawing closer. They were coming for me. But there was something else. A noise, something beyond the sounds of the creatures, faint but undeniable. A voice. Low. Hushed. Almost as if it were coming from far away, a distant whisper that felt like it was inside my skull. You can't escape. I froze, my blood running cold. Was it the creatures speaking to me? Or was it something else, something far worse? The voice seemed to reverberate in my mind, the words twisting and contorting as they wrapped themselves around my thoughts. I looked around, panic setting in as I searched the darkness for any sign of movement. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it filled every corner of the tunnel. You can't escape. There is no way out. I had to get out. I had to get away from whatever was making that voice. I ran again, blindly, desperate, my breath ragged and loud in the silence. But the creatures were already moving after me. I could hear them now, the sound of their claws scraping the stone, the soft clicking that echoed through the tunnels. I ran faster, my legs burning with the effort, but it felt like I was going nowhere. The darkness stretched out endlessly in front of me, and every time I thought I saw a way forward, the walls would shift, the tunnel would twist, and I would find myself right back where I started. The whisper followed me. It was everywhere now, filling my ears, my mind, a relentless reminder that there was no escape. You can't escape. It was true. The creatures, the voice, the shifting darkness, they were all part of the same nightmare, the same suffocating trap. There was no way out. And then I saw it. A flicker of light, faint and distant, like the glow of a dying flame. It was just a hint, a small promise of something beyond the endless darkness. I reached for it. But as I moved closer, the ground beneath me shifted again, the stone crumbling away, and I fell. This time, there was no stopping the fall. I plummeted, the darkness swallowing me whole, and I could feel the creatures, feel their presence just behind me, reaching, clawing at the air. There was no way out. There was no escape. And then, with a final, deafening silence, the darkness closed in around me. The creatures were gone. The whispers were gone. All that remained was the endless void. And in that silence, I realized something. It wasn't the creatures that were chasing me. It was the darkness. And it had one. The Legend of the Swamp Monster. I never thought much of the swamps of Louisiana. They were just swamps. A place where the air is thick with moisture and the world smells like earth and decay. The occasional rumor floated through town, tales about strange things seen out in the marshes, whispered stories about creatures that lurk in the depths. But I never paid them any mind. That was until I started hearing the stories from the workers. It began with a shift in tone, a nervous glance, a hushed whisper. Then, the first worker went missing. His name was Charlie. He had worked the swamps for as long as anyone could remember. I saw him just a day before, gruff and unshaven, as always. The man was tough as nails, the kind who didn't scare easy. And yet, the day after he disappeared, people said his friends heard him screaming in the night. They searched for hours but found nothing. No sign of struggle, no clue as to where he had gone. Just the sounds of something moving through the swamp, something that wasn't human. At first, people tried to laugh it off. But that's how things start, right? A joke, then a rumor, then a collective paranoia. I should have left then, but I was desperate. Desperate for work, desperate for anything that could keep the bills paid. I didn't think it would be so bad. I figured it was all some wild imagination at play, fueled by too much drink and too little sleep. But the fear, it was real. And it started spreading like wildfire. After Charlie's disappearance, a second worker went missing, then a third. The strange murmurs of the swamp grew louder in the stories people told. They said something in the swamp was calling them, something ancient, something that could make you feel like you weren't alone, even when you were. The rumors became more intense. They spoke of a creature, a swamp monster that was said to have risen from the depths. It was a thing that could change shape, change form, a thing that could create fear in the hearts of the bravest men. They said it had once been a human, long ago, cursed by the very swamp it now called home. But as time went on, the story evolved. The creature became more than just a man, more than just a monster. It was something that could turn the world around you into something terrifying, twisting reality until you no longer knew what was real. One evening, after a long day of working in the wet, sticky heat of the bayou, I heard the sound. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then it came again, louder this time. The sound of something large moving through the marsh. I thought nothing of it at first, just the wind, maybe, or an animal moving in the underbrush. But then the ground beneath me shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it, like a slight tremor in the earth. I glanced over at the workers around me. They were looking at each other, their eyes wide, their expressions hardening with something that looked like fear. "Did you hear that?" one of them asked. I nodded, feeling a chill creep up my spine. The sound was growing louder now. The ground seemed to pulse with it, vibrating underfoot. "Stay close," another man said, his voice low, barely a whisper. "Keep your eyes open." The sound was growing louder, closer. There was no mistaking it now. Something, or someone, was moving through the swamp. The trees around us began to groan, their branches shaking as though some unseen force was pushing through them. We moved cautiously, stepping through the thick mud, the air thick with the scent of decay. The oppressive heat weighed down on me, but it was the sound, the ever-present sound, that kept me on edge. It was like it was following us, closing in, growing louder with every step. And then I saw it. In the dimming light of the setting sun, a figure appeared in the distance, just barely visible through the thick foliage. I froze. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could recognize. The figure was tall, but hunched, its body twisting unnaturally. It was like it was made of shadows, a shape that shifted with every glance. And its eyes, those eyes, they glowed. A faint, eerie light, like a fire burning deep within the swamp. I felt my stomach drop. "Move," someone shouted, but I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran, our feet slipping in the thick mud, the sound of that thing following us, growing closer with every step. The swamps, once so familiar, had become something else, something foreign, something terrifying. And in the distance, I could hear a voice, a whisper, just barely audible above the rustling of the swamp. "You can't escape." I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just the wind, just the shadows playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't natural. This wasn't just a story. It was real. And it was coming for us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we sprinted through the muck. The swamps were no longer just an eerie backdrop, they had become a prison, closing in around us with every passing second. The trees, thick with moss, stretched out like dark, gnarled fingers, their twisted shapes casting long shadows on the ground. The air was suffocating, thick with humidity and a strange, musky scent that seemed to hang in the air. We didn't stop. We couldn't. The sound, the thing behind us, was too close now. Every few seconds, I would hear it, the soft, slithering noise of something moving through the muck, its steps not far behind us. And then, like a cold gust of wind, the unmistakable whisper echoed once more in my ear, chilling me to the bone. "You can't escape." It was coming closer, too close. I could feel it now, like a presence at my back, a weight on my shoulders. The men around me were panicking, their breaths ragged and fast. One man, a younger guy who had just started working here, tripped over a root and fell face first into the mud. The others barely noticed, their eyes fixed ahead, their minds locked in survival mode. But I saw it. I heard the faint, lit sound of something moving closer to him. I didn't need to look back to know what was coming. "Help me," he screamed, but his voice was drowned by the rising wail of the thing in the dark. I turned for only a second, just a brief glance to see if there was any chance to help him. That's when I saw it, barely visible through the thick mist and shadows, two glowing eyes, hovering just above the ground, watching me. I froze. Those eyes, they were not the same as anything I had seen in the swamp. They were unnatural, like cold fire, burning with an intelligence that was terrifying. For a moment, I felt my legs lock up, my body betraying me, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. "Move, damn it," someone shouted, yanking me out of my trance. I snapped to my senses, and we kept running, pushing through the thick underbrush. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something following us, its eyes burning through the fog. Every time I dared to glance back, I saw nothing but shadows, yet the feeling of being hunted grew stronger. We reached the edge of the swamp, the tree line opening up into a small clearing. For a brief moment, it felt like we had escaped. The trees were thinner here, and the ground was firm beneath our feet. I could hear the men's breaths, ragged and fast, as they collapsed to the ground, exhausted. But there was no time to rest. "Where's Charlie?" one of the workers asked, his voice trembling with panic. His eyes were wide, scanning the edges of the clearing as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. I turned to look, only to see that the young man who had fallen earlier was missing. In his place, there was nothing but the faint imprint of his struggle in the mud, a desperate trail of footprints that led deeper into the swamp. The ground had swallowed him up, just like the others. "He's gone," I whispered, the words feeling like acid on my tongue. Then, something shifted in the air. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, as if a cold breeze had swept through the clearing. The sound of the swamp had changed too. It was no longer the usual chorus of frogs and insects. Now, it was deathly still, like the world itself was holding its breath. The rustling returned, faint at first, but growing louder. Closer. I could hear it now, thudding, wet footsteps moving through the muck, closing in. And then, those eyes again, glowing faintly in the dark, like twin embers in the fog. It was back. The other men were starting to panic again. "We need to get out of here. Now," one of them screamed. But I could see it now, the thing, shifting like smoke, moving between the trees. It was tall, but hunched, a creature that was both man and monster, its limbs long and twisted, its body covered in dark, slick mud. Its eyes burned with that eerie light, watching us with a terrifying intelligence. One of the men tried to make a run for it, his legs pumping hard, his eyes wild with fear. But before he could take more than a few steps, the air around us seemed to warp, the shadows bending and twisting, and the thing was there. It moved impossibly fast, closing the distance between them in a split second. There was a wet, choking scream, then nothing. The man was gone, swallowed by the swamp. We froze, our hearts racing, unable to move. The thing turned its eyes to me then, and for a brief moment, I saw something in those glowing depths, something human, something familiar. It was like it knew me, like it was calling me by name. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The swamp had become a nightmare, a place where nothing was real anymore, where the land itself was alive, hungry, and waiting for us to slip. And I knew then that I was the next one on its list. "Run," someone shouted, but it was too late. The ground shifted beneath me, and in the next instant, I was falling, slipping into the thick, inky blackness of the swamp. My last thought before everything went dark was the terrible, knowing whisper that had followed us all this time. "You can't escape." And then, everything was silent. I woke up in a panic, gasping for breath as if I had been drowning. But the air was thick and oppressive, and I realized quickly that I wasn't drowning in water, I was suffocating on the wet, stifling air of the swamp. My head throbbed, my body aching from the fall, but there was no time to linger on that. My heart pounded in my chest as the memory of the creature flooded back, its eyes, its speed, the awful sound of the man's scream as he was consumed by the darkness. I forced myself to sit up, my hands slipping in the thick mud. My mind was racing. Where was I? The swamp had swallowed me whole, dragging me into its depths. But where were the others? The men who had been with me, had they made it out? Was I alone? I scanned the foggy surroundings, the oppressive silence pressing in on me. There was no sign of them. Only the sound of the distant swamp, its occasional croak or rustle, but it was eerily distant now. Everything felt wrong. The world around me felt alive, but not in a natural way. I tried to steady my breath, trying to think. There had to be some explanation for what was happening, some logical reason. But the more I thought about it, the more the memory of those glowing eyes, those sharp, predatory movements, came back to me. There was no explanation. There was no logic here. I forced myself to stand, but the world spun around me. I leaned against a tree for support, feeling its rough bark dig into my palms. The ground beneath me was soft, but I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay here. I didn't know what the creature was, but I knew it was close. The air felt heavier, the silence thicker. A sound. I froze. It was the faintest rustle, like something moving through the underbrush. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head, scanning the shadows. My eyes searched the dark corners of the swamp, but I saw nothing. Just shadows. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was still disoriented from the fall. But then, the rustling came again, this time louder. Closer. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of wet, slapping footsteps. My heart lurched. It was moving toward me. I didn't wait to see it. I turned on my heel and ran. I didn't know where I was going. There was no safe place in the swamp, but I ran, my legs burning from exhaustion. The ground was treacherous, thick with mud and roots that threatened to trip me with every step. I could hear it behind me now. The sound of its movement, deliberate, stalking. I glanced over my shoulder, and there it was. The creature. Its glowing eyes burning through the fog, closer than before, its long limbs stretching out impossibly far. It moved with a terrifying speed, gliding through the swamp like a predator, and I could feel its hunger in the air. Panic surged through me. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, the trembling in my limbs. The thing wasn't chasing me, it was playing with me, toying with its prey. But I wasn't going to let it catch me. I had to survive. I pushed myself harder, the sound of its footsteps now echoing through the swamp, growing louder. There was a part of me that screamed to stop, to turn and face it, but I knew that would be my death. I had to keep running. The mist thickened, swirling around me like a suffocating blanket, and I could hear the rustling growing more frantic, more insistent. Whatever it was getting closer. The air grew colder, and the darkness around me seemed to close in. A flash of movement to my right. I turned just in time to see something large, a shadow, dart between the trees. It was coming from all sides now. I stumbled forward, my foot catching on something, roots, branches, my body slamming into the ground. My breath was ragged, and I could hear the creature now, so close I could almost feel its breath on my neck. The unmistakable feeling of something right behind me. Something long, wet, and hungry. I pushed myself up, but my legs gave out, and I crashed back down into the mud. Desperation clawed at me. I needed to move. I had to get up. Suddenly, I heard a voice. A faint whisper, distorted by the sounds of the swamp. "Help me." I looked around, frantic, but saw nothing. The voice sounded familiar. It wasn't just in my head. Someone else was here, someone who had been calling for help, just like me. "Who's there?" I shouted into the darkness, but my voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. There was no response, only the sound of something moving closer. The eyes appeared again, glowing, just like before. There was no mistaking it now. It was coming for me. "Run," the voice whispered again, louder this time. I didn't know if it was real, if it was someone else, or if it was the creature mocking me. But something in that voice, the desperation, spurred me to my feet. I turned, not knowing where to go, but the creature was already there. The last thing I saw was its eyes, those terrible, burning eyes, and then everything went dark. I woke again to a sharp, biting cold that cut through my clothes like ice. My body trembled uncontrollably, as if the swamp's chill had settled deep into my bones. I opened my eyes, but the world around me was a blur, darkness mixed with the faint glow of a strange, sickly light. I couldn't see clearly, but I could feel the weight of the air around me, heavy and oppressive. For a moment, I thought I was still in the swamp. It felt like I was drowning, the air thick with moisture. I tried to move, but my limbs felt like they were bound, weighed down. Panic surged once more, but this time I had to fight it back. I had to figure out where I was. Slowly, I pushed myself into a sitting position, the cold ground beneath me gritty and wet. I reached out, my hand brushing against something rough. Stone? No, it wasn't stone. Wood. Wood that felt old, rotting, almost as if it had been here for centuries. I could hear the soft sounds of water dripping nearby, a low murmur that echoed through the space. It was the sound of the swamp, no mistake about that. But now it was different, contained within something. Something that felt unnatural. I forced myself to my feet, my head spinning. The cold sweat still clung to my skin, but the sensation of the swamp was gone, replaced by a sense of stillness that was worse than anything I had felt before. It was like being trapped in a tomb, the silence deafening, suffocating. The air here was thick with an unnatural staleness. The light was still dim, casting shadows that twisted and turned in ways that shouldn't have been possible. My breath quickened as I realized that the swamp was no longer around me. It had somehow consumed me, drawn me into its heart. But it was more than that. Something was watching me. I could feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I slowly turned in place, scanning the void. My eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence, the dim light, and the echoing sound of water dripping. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl. Soft at first, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. But it was unmistakable. The sound of something huge, moving through the dark. It was the creature. I knew it before the thought fully formed. The growl was too familiar, the resonance too close. It was in the darkness, watching, waiting. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't dare make a sound, didn't dare move. I had no idea where it was, but I knew it was there. The sensation of its presence was overwhelming, like the very air was thick with its hunger. For a long time, I stood there, motionless, listening to the growls and the sounds of something moving just beyond the reach of the faint light. The growl grew louder, closer, until I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through the very walls around me. Suddenly, the growl stopped. I didn't know why, but I felt a shift in the air. A silence fell, thick and complete, as if the creature was waiting for something. My body screamed for me to run, to escape, but my legs felt frozen. The only thing I could hear now was my own ragged breathing, the fear clawing at my throat. And then it came. A shadow, moving so fast it was like a blur, a massive, elongated shape slithering through the dark. Its eyes, glowing unholy green, locked onto mine. I could feel my pulse in my throat, hear the blood rushing in my ears. It was too close. I didn't even know where to go, what to do. My feet were rooted to the ground. The creature moved closer, its form shifting, changing, like liquid darkness itself. It was almost as if it was made of the night, an entity of pure terror. I tried to move, to react, but my body refused to obey. It was like my fear had taken control of me, freezing me in place. The creature's mouth opened, wide and gaping, revealing rows of teeth that gleamed like polished bone. It stepped forward, its movements smooth, deliberate, each step more menacing than the last. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just trapped in the dark. I had become part of its world, an unwilling guest in a nightmare that had no end. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stopped. The creature cocked its head, its glowing eyes flickering. A low hiss escaped its throat, a sound that sent a cold shiver running through me. It was like it was toying with me, sizing me up, deciding what to do next. And then, just as silently as it had come, it slithered back into the shadows. I didn't move. I didn't dare. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Whatever this place was, whatever that creature was, it was not done with me. It had only just started its hunt. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breath, trying to think. But every logical explanation I tried to form felt useless in the face of this impossible terror. It was no longer about survival, it was about trying to understand why this was happening, why it had chosen me. And then I remembered. The voice. The whisper. The one I had heard in the swamp before everything went dark. Run. But there was no place to run here. Not anymore. The silence stretched on. But it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of the hunter waiting for its prey to make a move. I had to escape. But where? And more importantly, how? The answer wasn't coming. It was buried beneath the layers of terror, hidden beneath the feeling of being watched. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. But the moment I made my move, I felt it. The eyes were on me. Again. I didn't dare to look. I couldn't. The weight of those eyes, those green, glowing eyes, felt like they were drilling into my soul, knowing every secret, every fear I had. The shadows seemed to bend and shift around me, crawling toward me like they were alive, pulling at my legs, dragging me deeper into the void. I could feel the presence of the creature just beyond my sight. I didn't need to see it. I could feel its cold, ancient hunger in the air, pressing down on me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. My breath came in shallow gasps, every movement painful, as though my very body was fighting against me. In a panicked haze, I stumbled backward, my hands scraping against the wet, rotting wood that lined the walls of whatever hellish place I was trapped in. The growl started again, closer this time, unmistakable, like a warning. I could feel the vibrations through my feet, the ground trembling under the weight of the creature's approach. I had no choice. There was nowhere to go. I ran. It wasn't graceful or controlled. I barely knew where I was going, only that I had to move, had to get away. My body slammed into the wooden beams, tripping over unseen obstacles, every step like a cry of desperation. The air was thick and suffocating, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. But I ran faster, faster, the growls growing louder, closer. Then came the sound that would haunt me forever. A sharp, bone-chilling screech. The unmistakable sound of claws tearing into wood, sharp and deliberate. The creature had caught up to me. I was too slow. I wasn't going to make it. I threw myself forward, my legs trembling beneath me. Someone whispered my name, barely audible over the deafening noise in my head. I couldn't make sense of it, couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was as if the very air was alive with voices. Ghosts. I didn't have time to think. The growl rose to a deafening pitch, and I could feel the air shift behind me, felt the hot, rank breath of the creature on my neck. My skin crawled. My heart pounded against my chest like it would tear itself free. Then, just as I thought it was over, I saw it. A flicker of light. A distant, soft glow like a fading star in the dark sky. My mind clung to it, desperate, not knowing where it came from but certain it was my only hope. Without thinking, I threw myself toward it. I pushed through the thick air, stumbling over debris, my breath ragged, barely able to see through the tears in my eyes. The screeches of the creature echoed in my ears, mocking my attempt to escape. But that light. It was closer now. Just a few more steps, just a few more. I reached out, my hand stretching toward it, the light gleaming like a beacon. But when my fingers brushed against it, everything went black. I awoke again to the same oppressive darkness, But now there was no growl, no screech, just silence. The chill was gone. The coldness of the swamp had been replaced by an unnatural warmth, the kind that felt too heavy to breathe. The air was thick with the same oppressive presence I had felt before. I didn't move, too terrified to even blink. The silence stretched on for an eternity, a never-ending weight pressing down on me. And then I heard it. A whisper, low and menacing. "Welcome home." I didn't need to ask what it meant. I had known from the moment I entered the darkened world beneath the swamp that there would be no escape. The creature had never been interested in hunting me. It had been leading me here all along. To this place, this dark prison. My body trembled as the realization sank in. I had been chosen. Not just to die, but to become part of it, a part of the swamp, a part of the creature's endless hunger. The ground beneath me began to shift, to twist. The walls seemed to pulse, alive, breathing. My breath caught in my throat as the space around me began to shrink. The light I had chased was gone now, leaving only darkness. The growl echoed once more, distant, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The swamp would never let me go. It would consume me, as it had consumed others before me. And as the darkness closed in, I knew that this was not the end. This was the beginning of something far worse. Something eternal. And in that final moment, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I felt the cold, clammy touch of something else, something far older and far more terrifying than anything I had ever imagined. I was no longer alone. I had become one with the monster. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.